Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding, we thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that, we having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be, to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Morning all. Before we begin the business of the day, we wish to recognize a number of visitors that we have in the Parliament with us today. First of all, there are 3 persons from the Bureau of Gender Affairs, which is an adjunct of the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, who have come today and have pinned the members of the Senate and staff of the Parliament with a purple ribbon, which you are observing on a number of the members of the Senate and staff here, and they are in the gallery. And the purple ribbon is to mark the week recognizing the movement against violence perpetrated against women and girls. So that is the reason for the ribbon, which I think is actually being distributed to a number of our guests now. So welcome, and we are happy to participate in this recognition. Secondly, we are joined by a number of students, 40 of them from Shortwood Teachers College. Would you just indicate where you are? Excellent. Thank you very much. And they are accompanied by one of the teachers there, and a number, in fact, 20 students from the University of the West Indies, Western Campus. Just indicate where you are. Excellent. Good. Okay, so you are from Western or Carmack? Oh, beautiful. I was, you know. So we have some university students from University of the West Indies, Western Campus. Just indicate for me, please. Marvelous. And some students from Carmack. Just indicate for me, please. Good. Okay. Welcome to this sitting of the Senate. You will, in the course of things, recognize what is happening today. The leader of government business will be presenting some regulations, and you will be able to follow the discussion there. I always point out to people that visit us that this is your parliament, it is your Senate as citizens of this country, and you're entitled to come here and participate in the program in the Senate by observation on any occasion that you wish. So feel free to join us, and if there are any questions, you can present them to the clerks, and we will attempt to facilitate you in every way that we can. But most importantly, remember that this is your Senate, it is a part of your democracy, and your participation by understanding the process of the democracy is always critical to the continuation of that democracy. Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the Senate today are the following. Minister Paper Number 77, Annual Report of the Jamaica Dairy Development Board for year 2016-2017. Minister Paper Number 78, Annual Report of the SCJ Holdings Limited for the crop 2009-2010. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements for the National Housing Trust for the year 2017-2018. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements of the Jamaica Bauxite Institute Limited, JBI, for the year 2017-2018. Annual Report on Audited Financial Statements of the Sports Development Foundation for the year 2017. Jamaica Hansard Parliamentary Proceedings of the Honourable House of Representatives, September 9, 2014 to December 9, 2014. Hansard Proceedings of the Honourable Senate, January 2014 to July 2014 and September 2014 to December 2014. Annual Report of the Broadcasting Commission for the year 2018-2019. The National Craft Policy and Integrated Approach from the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries. The United Nations Security Council Resolutions Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations 2019 and the United Nations Security Council Resolutions Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations 2019 Resolution. The Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Regulations 2019 and the Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Regulations 2019 Resolution. The Integrity Commission Remuneration of Commissioners Resolutions 2019. The Public Bodies Management and Accountability Nomination, Selection and Appointment to Boards Regulations 2019. The Public Bodies Management and Accountability Nomination, Selection and Appointment to Boards Regulations 2019 Resolution. The Civil Service Establishment General Order 2019 under the Civil Service Establishment General Order 2019 Resolution under the Civil Service Establishment Act for information.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Just before I move to the next item, I neglected earlier to ask the members of the Senate to recognize the presence of former Senator Dr. Andre Franklin. Welcome, Dr. Franklin. Bills brought from the Honourable House of Representatives.
The following is a message from the Speaker of the House of Representatives to the Honourable Senate. I have the honour to advise the Honourable Senate that on the 19th day of November 2019, a bill entitled An Act to Amend and Rename the Human Employment and Resource Training Act to merge the functions of the Human Employment and Resource Training Trust with the National Youth Service Board and the Apprenticeship Board, to repeal the Apprenticeship Act and the National Youth Service Act and for connected matters, was passed in the House of Representatives with 23 amendments. Signed, Pernell P. Charles, Senior, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President, I signify my willingness to take charge of the bill.
A bill shortly entitled Human Employment and Resource Training Amendment and Change of Name Act 2019, read a first time.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
Thank you. Madam Clerk. Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the Senate, I will move the following motions. Whereas subsection 1G1 of section 41 of the Constitution of Jamaica requires a member of this Honourable Senate to vacate his seat if any firm in which he is a partner or any company of which he is a director or manager becomes a party to any contract with the Government of Jamaica for or on account of the public service, or if he becomes a partner in a firm or a director or manager of a company which is a party to any such contract. And whereas Senator Owen Hill is a director and shareholder of Indies Pharma Jamaica Limited and Independent Renewable Energy and Electronics Limited, trading as Iris Solar, as well as chairman of the advisory board of the All-American Institute of Medical Sciences, Senator Hill is also a director and shareholder of Nation Growth Microfinance Limited, now trading as Up Finance. These companies may from time to time enter into contracts with the Government of Jamaica and its agencies. And whereas Senator Owen Hill has disclosed his interest in these entities, be it resolved that this Honourable Senate, pursuant to subsection 1G1 of section 41 of the Constitution, and in recognition of him having disclosed his interest in the named entities, exempt the said senator from vacating his seat for reasons as aforesaid. Under the Integrity Commission Act, the Integrity Commission Remuneration of Commissioners Resolution 2019. Whereas by virtue of Section 5 of the Integrity Commission Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, there is established a Commission of Parliament to be known as the Integrity Commission, hereinafter referred to as the Commission, and whereas by virtue of subsection 3 of Section 5 of the Act, the Commission shall be constituted by 5 commissioners appointed pursuant to Section 8 of the Act, and whereas Section 6 of the Act provides generally for the functions of the Commission, and whereas by virtue of Section 22 of the Act, there shall be paid from the funds of the Commission to the Chairman and other Commissioners of the Commission such remuneration, whether by honorarium, salary, or fees, and such allowances as may be approved by resolution of the House of Representatives and of the Senate. And whereas the remuneration structure set out in the schedule to this resolution outlines the remuneration per annum at which the Chairman and the other Commissioners of the Commission shall be paid, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as the Integrity Commission Remuneration of Commissions Resolution 2019, and 2. The Integrity Commission Remuneration of Commissioners Resolution 2019, which was laid on the table of the Senate on the 29th day of November 2019, is hereby affirmed. Under the Terrorism Prevention Act, the Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Regulation 2019 Resolution. Whereas by virtue of Section 47(1) of the Terrorism Prevention Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may make regulations subject to affirmative resolution, generally for giving effect to the provisions and purposes of the Act. And whereas on the 28th day of November 2019, the Minister made the Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Regulations 2019, and whereas it is desirable that the Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Regulations 2019 be affirmed, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as a Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Regulations 2019 resolution. And 2. The Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Regulations 2019, which were laid on the table of the Senate on the 29th day of November 2019, are hereby affirmed. Under the United Nations Security Council Resolutions Implementation Act, the United Nations Security Council Resolutions Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations 2019 Resolution. Whereas by virtue of subsection 1 of Section 21 of the United Nations Security Council Resolutions Implementation Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, The Minister may make regulations prescribing matters required or permitted by the Act to be prescribed or necessary or convenient to be prescribed for carrying out or giving effect to the Act. And whereas, by virtue of subsection 2 of section 21 of the Act, regulations made under the section may make provisions as to the programs, policies, procedures, and controls to be established and implemented by entities mentioned in section 5.2 of the Act for the purposes of enabling compliance with the Act. And whereas, on the 28th day of November 2019, the Minister made the United Nations Security Council Resolutions Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations 2019, and whereas it is desirable that the United Nations Security Council Resolutions Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations 2019 be affirmed, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as the United Nations Security Council Resolution Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations 2019 Resolution. 2. The United Nations Security Council Resolution Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations 2019, which were laid on the table of the Senate on the 29th day of November 2019, are hereby affirmed. Under the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Nomination, Selection, and Appointment to Boards Regulations 2019 Resolution. Whereas, by virtue of Section 24(1)(c) of the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may make regulations generally for giving effect to the provisions and purposes of the Act and may in particular specify criteria for the appointment of boards to public bodies. And whereas on the 26th day of November 2019, the Minister made the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Nomination, Selection, and Appointment to Boards Regulations 2019, and whereas by virtue of Section 24(2) of the Act, any regulations made under subsection 1 shall be subject to affirmative resolution, and whereas it is desirable that the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Nomination, Selection, and Appointment to Boards Regulations 2019 be affirmed by resolution, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Nomination, Selection, and Appointment to Boards Regulations 2019 Resolution. And 2. The Public Bodies Management and Accountability Nomination, Selection, and Appointment to Boards Regulations 2019, which were laid on the table of the Senate on the 29th day of November 2019, are hereby affirmed. Mr. President, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of standing orders to permit me to take the first 4 mentioned motions.
Thank you, Minister. Questions and answers to questions?
Mr. President, there are questions on the question notice paper standing in the name of Senator Lambert Brown posed to me, and I am prepared to take those at this time.
Thank you.
With the assurance from the Minister that she is prepared to give these answers today, I am prepared to receive them.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Minister, just hang on a minute. Let them just.
Well,
Thank you, Minister.
these are the responses to questions asked in the Senate by Senator Lambert Brown to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade and Leader of Government Business. Question 1, can the Minister confirm that Cabinet in July 2018 approved new corporate governance guidelines for board appointments for public bodies? Answer. The policy guidelines for the nomination, selection, and appointment of the boards of public bodies were approved by Cabinet decision of May 28, 2018. Drafting instructions were subsequently given to the Chief Parliamentary Council for the preparation of regulations under the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, which would bring the policy provisions into effect. The said regulations were tabled in the House of Representatives on Tuesday, November 26, 2019 by the Minister of Finance and the Public Service. We may note, Mr. President, that they have also been tabled in this Senate today. Question 2, can the Minister state how many boards of public bodies have been appointed since August 2018? Answer. As at September 30th, 2019, that is from August 2018, Cabinet approved the appointment of 82 boards of public bodies. Question 3. Can the Minister state how many of these boards have been appointed in accordance with the approved corporate governance guidelines? Answer. As indicated above, aspects of the policy guidelines in relation to the nomination and selection of the boards of public bodies will not take effect until the regulations have been affirmed and are operational. Pending same, ministries have, however, generally paid attention to matters such as gender representation, competence, compliance with statutory requirements, and retention of members for continuity in line with the said policy guidelines. Question 4. If any of these boards have been appointed in accordance with the approved corporate governance guidelines, which are the boards of public bodies that have been so appointed? As stated above, the regulations to implement the approved guidelines have only this week been tabled in the lower house and are therefore not yet in effect. While ministries would have generally applied principles indicated at answer 3 above, it would be difficult to expect that all boards would have followed all the steps outlined in the policy guidelines. Question 5. If any of those boards have been appointed in accordance with the approved corporate governance guidelines, can the Minister state the specific steps in the process that was followed in each case in order to ensure that those board appointments complied with the approved corporate governance guidelines? Answer. Please refer to answers 3 and 4 above. However, an example of a ministry which has documented steps followed is the Ministry of Finance and Public Service, which advised that in appointing boards of the public bodies within its remit, 1, the competency profile was used. 2, at least 1/3 of the directors from the outgoing boards were reappointed to facilitate continuity and effectiveness of the boards. 3, recommendations and nominations were sought from various professional bodies. And 4, consideration was given to board diversity issues.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Brown.
Thank you, President. Let me say this probably is the shortest time it has taken for answers to be provided to questions that I've tabled. Minister's trying to get specific in terms of numbers, but that has been avoided in the answer. For example, and let me say also that I'm happy that having raised the questions, the minister has been moved to bring the regulation. It's all right. I am happy that having raised the questions, the minister has been moved to table just this week, the regulations. We look forward to debating the regulations. But having had the grand announcement last year about integrity and new approach to boards, we are being told that has to wait 1 year from last year, 1 year plus, for it to be done. We thought there would have been urgency to have done it last year. Now, in terms of question, and not at all. Question number 2. We're told that 82 boards have been approved and appointed by Cabinet since September It says at the end of September 29, so you take it post-July last year to now 82 boards have been appointed. Well, those are the only boards I was asking about, the public bodies. And then question 3 asks, how many of these boards have been approved? We're told that that policy is not going to take effect until the regulations are affirmed and are operational. And I'd like to ask, when do you expect that to be? When do you expect the regulations to be affirmed and operational? That I'll stop at that, and then I'll come back and answer.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Minister?
Thank you. As you are aware, the regulations were tabled in the lower house, where they have to be debated and affirmed there, and they have been tabled here, where they also have to be debated and affirmed. So in accordance with the legislative agenda, they will be pursued. I will take guidance from the Minister of Finance. As you know, it would be better for them to be debated in the lower house, as he has policy remit first. In the event that there are to be any changes, they would have to be withdrawn and retabled. If they are, however, affirmed in their current state, then we will take them here.
President, it will be useful for the country to know, especially with so many boards coming under pressure for being corrupt and all of that, that we'll get a sense of how soon and what, Petrojam among others, Nestle among others. So let me not go there. So we'd love to get a sense from the cabinet members present as to what is the thinking in terms of expediting the legislative agenda to facilitate the operationalizing of these regulations.
You know, I heard the answer enough.
No. In accordance with the legislative agenda, I'm trying to get a sense of the urgency with which the government is addressing that issue, and to get a sense of, is it likely to be this part of the fiscal year, between now and December, which is next week, or are we going to wait next year? There are too many regulations that we're depending on, road traffic and all of that, and they can't come. So I'm trying to get a sense as to whether the government intending another month or less to put these to us. That's what I'm trying to get.
Mr. President, as I indicated, the regulations have now been tabled. They've been tabled in both houses. As I would hope the senator would understand, although I am a member of the cabinet, I certainly cannot take decisions on behalf of another member of cabinet. The Minister of Finance and the Public Service, who has policy remit for these regulations, will indicate, he has indicated, however, that they are important and he will be treating with them with expedition. And accordingly, we can follow the agenda as they were only tabled this Tuesday.
I heard that, you know.
President, Brown. I don't know about them, but I see some regulation tabled today for debate and approval today. So why isn't there an urgency to ensure that we get these boards up and running in accordance with the guideline that the government approved over 1 year ago?
Senator Brown.
Yeah.
I think that hello. I think you can move on. The minister has indicated that there is a timeline. I heard the timeline, so ask another question.
Maybe you could share with me the timeline, because I didn't hear it.
Let me tell you what the timeline is.
Yes.
The regulations have been tabled in the lower house. They have been tabled here as well. The process of the parliament requires them to be approved and debated in the lower house. And since it is the view of the minister that the relevant minister is in the lower house, the process will be completed in the lower house before it come here. How you expect the minister, the leader of government business in the Senate, to dictate and to indicate to us what the timeline is in the lower house, I fail to understand. So ask the next question.
President, let me make it clear. you, like I, know that cabinet is collective responsibility. Cabinet is collective responsibility, and therefore we expect when a cabinet minister comes to us, we believe that when a cabinet minister comes to us, they will reflect the collective view of the cabinet, not an individual view. And so, but I understand, I'll move on from that, because what is clear to us is that the government is not ready with dispatch implement this important regulation. Minister, in question 3 also said that pending same, ministries have, however, generally paid attention to matters such as gender representation, competence, compliance with statutory requirements. That's not new. Every board have taken that approach. So really, that's not new. Is that Robbie Rose in game today? Because I'm not into that. I'm not into that. I want answers to questions that the public is concerned about.
Listen, let me explain, Senator Brown, with the greatest of respect, right? If you don't ask a question, you can't get an answer. What you did a while ago was just really a statement, you know. So if you have a question, ask it. I will direct the minister to answer accordingly.
Minister, am I correct that these requirements are not new? That's the question. That's the question. Since you want a question. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. What I can indicate, some of them certainly are not new, but the retention of at least 1/3 for continuity is new. But they are there for emphasis, as the question was asked, and it was my understanding that what you wished was an understanding of how the boards are operating, which I've sought my best to do. I could have simply answered no from the first question, because the answer to that question was no. But I knew you were trying to get at something else, and I tried to be helpful. I wanted to indicate, regardless of your view or your conclusion that the government is not ready, you are well aware that when substantive regulations are tabled, the opposition requires time to review them so that they can be debated from a position of information and understanding. And one would expect that we would respect the process, which usually requires a week, even as where there are matters which are uncontroversial,
so today we can expect
or where matters have been taken before and circulated before informally to make sure that they could have been reviewed, that the same process would be followed. So it is not that the government is not ready. The government has tabled them in both houses, and the minister who is responsible for them will take them. And I just want to make clear that, yes, because the position which you asserted shows a misunderstanding of the principle of collective responsibility. Collective responsibility means that we are all collectively responsible for the decisions of cabinet, but it does not change policy remit. Each minister swears to take responsibility for a set of policies, ministries, departments, and agencies, and that is where it ends. That's not what cabinet collective responsibility means.
Mr. President, when a government blames the opposition for non-implementation of policy, it's time for that government to go. So, President, you need to control the rabble.
I noticed that Senator Webby has been participating in some noise that I'm hearing from the right.
Senator Webby? Of all people?
It was
no,
him.
Sir.
It was him.
I don't think you're hearing right.
Let's go, Senator Brown. Let's go. We have some visitors from out of town.
I'm trying to move on, but if the noise is coming from there and I can't hear myself, I won't be able to speak to the issues. Question 4. By the time, Let's take the 1/3. Isn't it not true, Minister, that the 1/3 you retain are people appointed by this government? Not so what? It's exposing the hypocrisy. Because what you're doing is reappointing the people you appointed before and coming to tell us that that's a virtue. That's not a virtue. President.
That's the improvement in governance.
The question we asked at 4, if any of those boards have been appointed in accordance with the approved corporate governance guideline, which are the boards of public bodies that have been so appointed? We have not received an answer in terms of the specific boards that have been so appointed. What we are told is that while Ministry have generally applied principle indicate that answer 3 above, it would be difficult to expect all boards would have followed. How many of the boards reappointed of the 82 has followed this? And could we get a list of those boards where that was followed? That's what we want to find out on behalf of the people of the country. Pretty talk, but slow, if any action at all.
That's it?
No, I'm waiting for an answer. Ask questions. I've asked a question. I want to know how many of the boards, how many of these 82 have met the criteria.
See, the problem, Senator Brown, is that your run-up is so long when you bowl the ball, I can't see it.
Mr. President, I will try to be helpful again, because the fact is that the regulations to implement the policy guidelines are not yet in effect. They have just been tabled. So I can provide you of a list of the 82 boards which have been appointed within the period of time that you have asked, understanding that they have generally applied the principles of good governance in terms of looking at gender representation, competence, compliance with statutory guidelines, etc., and the retention policy of at least 1/3 for continuity. But in terms of a step-by-step process for each board, I mean, I suppose I could ask all of the permanent secretaries to sit down and try and spend their time to do that and to go through, but I cannot say when I would be able to provide that. So,
Thank you, Minister.
President, I thank the Minister for offering to provide us with the list, and I hope that you will guarantee that we get the list of the 82 and so forth.
I advise the Minister to ask the permanent secretary
No.
time to do that.
President.
The list, no problem.
President.
The list.
Yeah.
The list.
Yes, that's what I asked for. So, I mean, all of a sudden we want to protect permanent secretary when certain people in ECG want to fire them. I don't understand. President, we're told that the Ministry of Finance have implemented so much these guidelines. Could I ask how many boards and which are the boards in the Ministry of Finance where these guidelines have been applied to? You want to give it one by one? And when will we get it, Mr. President? Since you have been able to direct her, maybe you could direct her to give us next week? President, what that mean? 3 months' time or next week? You want to rise so that we get it an answer that you're promising it for next week?
I will send the list of the 82 boards of public bodies next week.
Yeah, and I hope, Minister, that you will identify in that list those in the Ministry of Finance that have followed the guidelines. Since the Minister has taken paternity for this approach, much public relations was given to the country, new and different as you are in the fight against corruption and the fight against dengue. What we're seeing is that it's pretty talk, but little or no action. May it please you, Mr. President.
Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sitting of the Senate. Senator Webby, please don't let me call to you again. Motions for leave to introduce bills. The presentation of bills without the leave of the Senate first obtained. Public business.
Mr. President.
Sorry, Senator Morris, I recognize you as representing today the leader of opposition business.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it is intended today at public business to address 4 of the 5 motions, notice of which I gave earlier, to take the minimum business tax repeal act, and on the notice of motion of adjournment, there should be a statement in relation to the marking of International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. I have been advised by the Leader of Opposition Business in the Senate that Dr. Haughton will not be continuing with the State of the Nation debate today by making his contribution, so that agenda item will not be pursued today.
Delay by the opposition. Delay by the opposition. A delay by the opposition, Senator Brown. I don't understand. My brother and friend.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Minister.
Mr. President, I wish to ask for the suspension of standing orders to allow me to take the 4 motions, the first 4 motions, notice of which I gave earlier, those being the motion, the Section 41 motion, the motion in relation to the Integrity Commission, the motion in relation to Terrorism Prevention, and the motion in relation to the UN Security Council resolution implementation, Mr. President. Those 4.
In that order?
Yes. No.
You want to take them together?
Yes, I'll take them in that order.
The leader to take the 4 motions just identified, to take them as one. Take them together. To take them together. Okay, I understand. She's just moving the motion. Yes, okay. Well, you have heard. Those in favor? Against? Go ahead, please, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we could take the shortest one first, which is the one in relation to Section 41 of the Constitution. Mr. President, members would have heard the resolution put before. It is not a motion which is usually subject to debate, and I would ask that it be affirmed. This is a Section 41, whereas Senator Aubin Hill has... If the motion could be put.
The question is that the motion relating to Section 41 of the Constitution as it relates to Senator Aubin Hill. Those in favor? Against?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it is now intended to take the resolutions in relation to the Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Regulations and the United Nations Security Council Resolution Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations. And these, Mr. President, I propose to take together because they are the continuation of the suite of legislation which we have recently been addressing in both houses of this Parliament. That is those which deal with anti-money laundering as well as counter-financing of terrorism and proliferation financing. Mr. President, at our last sitting, we passed the poker regulations, which form the base of both of these regulations. And at the sitting before that, Mr. President, we passed acts to amend both the Terrorism Prevention Act and the United Nations Security Council Resolution Implementation Act. So, Mr. President, I think senators have been sufficiently sensitized and are aware that what we are seeking as a government to do is to ensure that our financial systems are sufficiently robust and well regulated that we can soundly and strongly advocate internationally for more flexibility and effective treatment of not only investors in cannabis, but also in our general rating as a country which is viewed as one with sound financial systems, one with a place in which it is good to invest, good to do business, and one which is well respected on the international and domestic scene. Mr. President, I had circulated regulations which had been made on the 19th of November. But on review, we identified just a few matters that needed to be changed. And I can just clearly outline them now, where they can be found in the regulations that were tabled, dated November 28th, the ones which have been tabled today, as it's fairly easy to follow where the changes were made. Mr. President, I would ask members to turn first to page 3, page Terrorism. Under TPA regulations, on page 3, in about the middle of the page, there is 5 big B, little b, documented the risks of terrorist financing involved. Mr. President, the words there before were money laundering. Money laundering has been deleted and replaced with terrorist financing in the second line of subparagraph little b of paragraph 5 big B. I would ask members to now turn to page 4. At the very top of the page, there's paragraph C. Again, the last words in that paragraph are terrorist financing. They have replaced the words money laundering, which were there before. In the penultimate paragraph on that page, that is paragraph little b under paragraph 5 big D, and again the words terrorist financing have been used to replace money laundering. And I would now move to page 7. Page 7, where at the very top of the page, in paragraph A, the reference is now to paragraph 3, not paragraph 2. Following in little paragraph A, same subparagraph, the words terrorist financing in the third line have replaced the words money laundering. And in the immediately succeeding paragraph B, the words terrorist financing have also replaced the words money laundering in the last line. Immediately following in paragraph B, in parentheses, the number 3 has been replaced with the number 4, so it says now by deleting paragraph 4 and substituting the following. And at the very end of the page, in paragraph B, which refers to the parish court fine, the fine is $5 million, not $1 million. $5 million to align it with the POCA and with the UN Security Resolution regulations. If we can look very quickly at the UN Security Council regulations as well, where there is only, I believe, one change, and this is a change, in paragraph B, at the bottom of page 4 of the UN Security Council Implementation Reporting Entities Regulations, we're changing, again, the fine there from 3 million to 5 million. We're changing the fine for a body corporate in paragraph B at the end. So it's regulation 8. Regulation 8 subparagraph 3B, at the very bottom of page 4, sorry. In the case of a body corporate, a fine not exceeding $5 million instead of 3. Yes, so it's, again, aligned with POCA and the TPA, Mr. President. So these changes have been made to ensure that, for example, in relation to terrorism prevention, that the regulations are targeted. While they are relevant to money laundering, because money laundering is a mechanism which is often used to finance terrorist activities, it is, however, these regulations are in fact narrow and focus on terrorist financing, while the UNSCRIA focuses on terrorist financing and proliferation financing. And Jamaica will in fact be soon hosting a technical conference in relation to proliferation financing, where the Caribbean technicians will be attending in Jamaica, and members of the the international organizations which focus on terrorist financing and proliferation financing will also be attending here for training and improvement and practicing of implementation of best practices in proliferation financing, which is actually quite a technical area. And I'm just being reminded of one typographical error, which is on page 6, which was corrected on page 6 of the UNSCRIA regs, and that is in paragraph 2 on the page, right in the center of the page. It now says nothing in paragraph 1E shall be construed. The document which had been circulated on the 19th had just said nothing in paragraph E. So it just is inserting the number numeral 1 before the letter E in parentheses. So, Mr. President, so the context, of course, as we all recall, is that Jamaica is not only strengthening our system, but we are in our financial systems, but we are making sure that we move out of the enhanced follow-up process in which we have been placed by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force and the Financial Action Task Force, which are, of course, the Caribbean and international organizations charged with addressing matters of anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, how it is that financial systems ensure that robust systems are in there to protect them from illicit use in these categories. Mr. President, we know that the mutual evaluation report was issued in 2017, and that the meetings are now taking place, continuing from now, and we have another set of meetings in February. One set of meetings took place last week, at which Jamaica's performance and our compliance is being assessed. And it is with every intent and every effort that can be made that Jamaica intends to ensure that we are not downgraded and that we are in fact upgraded from our current situation. The regulations before us, Mr. President, will ensure that this is what occurs. So, Mr. President, as stated on another occasion, Section 47 allows the minister to make regulations under the Terrorism Prevention Act. And these regulations, when affirmed today, are to be read and construed with the Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Regulations of 2010. Mr. President, Regulation 2 is amended by these regulations by deleting the definitions of competent authority and designated authority. As senators would recall, those are now in the Principal Act, they're in the Amendment Act, and therefore moved from the regulations. Regulation 5 is being amended by inserting an additional subparagraph 2, which clarifies that evidence of the applicant's identity is satisfactory if it is reliable evidence of the customer's identity derived from an independent source. Mr. President, that's what's there now. So it is now being strengthened to say that the evidence must be taken from an independent source before business is conducted, and it is implementing aspects of the customer due diligence requirements of the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, Mr. President. Regulation 6A of the principal regulation is also being amended, and this is the section that deals with the risk-based assessment, which senators would recall when we amended the Act. This allows businesses to assess whether transactions or relationships are high risk or low risk, and if they are low risk, they may use simplified due diligence processes. If they are high risk, then of course they must ensure that the appropriate protective measures are taken. So there is no, Mr. President, paragraph 1 will be deleted and a new paragraph provided, which requires businesses in regulated sectors to establish a risk profile relating to its operations generally, and that this should have regard to its business products offers, distribution channels, national, regional, and international environment, if any, in which the regulated business operates, and of course, its size and the nature of its business. So if you are a small business doing fairly localized, microfinance with a very low threshold, etc., then clearly your risks would be less than a large insurance agency, which can be used by way of insurance contracts to launder money or to channel terrorist financing, etc., to beneficiaries. So it allows for flexibility within the system as opposed to prior regulations or other approaches which generally take a broad brush and every business is required. And then, of course, you get into a problem where companies are unable to comply as they don't have the resources. And that's not the intent here. It is to find an appropriate balance. So, Mr. President, companies will have the duty to employ measures commensurate with the risks that they have identified in order to mitigate them. And of course, at the risk of stating the obvious, they cannot use simplified due diligence process for high-risk relationships or high-risk transactions, which are likely to be related to money laundering or terrorist financing. Mr. President, paragraph 2 of Regulation 6A is being amended to include a new subparagraph E, which again focuses on what needs to be done where relationships or transactions are high risk. Paragraph 5B of Regulation 6A is being amended to indicate that enhanced due diligence procedures will require verification of the source of funds and wealth. It was actually a deficiency on which Jamaica had been reported before, that the original regulations required that you verify source of funds or wealth, but it is required, in fact, that both be verified. So, Mr. President, that is, again, one of the amendments that will move us out of the rating in which we are currently placed. Mr. President, Regulation 6A is further being amended to include new paragraphs 5A, 5D, 5A to 5D, which again further particularize the issues of due diligence in relation to business relationships or one-off transactions. And one of the matters there is the fact that the competent authority provides approval, written approval, in relation to the application of simplified processes for low-risk transactions. Mr. President, because that is the competent authority must assure itself that you are, in fact, your assessment is a good one because you have implemented the type of process that's necessary to assess whether the transaction or the business relationship is high or low risk. Mr. President, paragraph 5B of Regulation 6A prescribes that the written gives further prescription in relation to the written approval which must be granted, and again how it identifies and documents risks in relation to terrorist financing under the TPA regs, which is what we're going through. Let me just remind everybody that we're not going between the two now. We're still in terrorist prevention regulations. So, Mr. President, paragraph 5C of Regulation 6A also authorizes the competent authority to impose any conditions that it considers appropriate in its written approval when it's granted under 5B. And 5D provides, in relation to 5A, the simplified due diligence procedures must include any one or more of the 5 procedures which are listed. So companies will have guidance as to the type of process. They're not left to figure it out by themselves, Mr. President. Although, of course, there will be further guidelines and sensitization carried out by the FID. Mr. President, subparagraph E indicates that the competent authority, well, that I've indicated already. In relation to 6B, Mr. President, this clause deals with due diligence for enhanced purposes. This is where special countermeasures need to be taken in relation to business relationships or transactions which are listed under Regulation 6823, or where the application for business is resident in jurisdictions which have been listed or designated as high risk by public statements of the FATF. So this is the type of situation which Jamaica doesn't wish to find itself, so that other countries would impose procedures or enhanced procedures on our business transactions if we were listed in a negative manner by the FATF. Mr. President, it provides for the insertion of a new Regulation 6B, which empowers the competent authority to direct the business in the regulated sector to apply the enhanced due diligence procedures stipulated, and to direct that the relevant reports be provided at more frequent intervals if it is that this is a company from a high-risk jurisdiction. Mr. President, these high-risk jurisdictions are specified in a list which is gazetted, given notice to the public by Gazette. So it is not a list which is one that would be uncertain at any point in time. These requirements are not at large, and these are also the lists that will be available, that are available on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade website, as well as, of course, on the FID website. Mr. President, in respect of Regulation 11, it's being amended to mandate that the reporting entity takes reasonable measures for the purposes of verifying and identifying the principal and agent, and verifying that the agent is authorized to act on behalf of the principal in respect of business relationships or one-off transactions where it's apparent that the person is an agent or is an agent. And this is part of the FATF requirement to verify the identity of all parties to a transaction, whether the parties are disclosed or apparent, as part of customer due diligence requirements. Mr. President, Regulation 13 contains supplementary provisions for identification procedures, and it's being amended to clarify the threshold for evidence of identity, and these are set out in the regulations, specifically paragraph 1A and B are helpful in this regard. Mr. President, there's also a new subparagraph C, which dictates that the evidence of identity is satisfactory in the case of an insurance contract where the evidence identifies and verifies the identity of the beneficiary. And you would recall that we discussed in the amendment that the identity of the beneficiary needs to be verified at the point of payout. So no one is trying to slow down or complicate the process of seeking a contract of insurance, and this is life insurance, not general insurance. But when a payout is to be made, which is of course the point at which there would be a beneficiary, if false, would be about to collect money which could be channeled illicitly, the beneficiary must be identified prior to outpayment by the insurance company. Mr. President, paragraph 1C2 of Regulation 13 treats with the identification and verification of identities of individuals who exercise ultimate effective control of a company. So as you recall, we have done a raft of reforms in relation to the global forum and how it is corporate governance is implemented in general companies and international business corporations. And part of that, of course, has been now ensuring that beneficial owners and beneficiaries owners of shares, that they are also noted and registered. So these regulations now look behind transactions to ensure that it's not just a face of a company that's put forward. The verification of identity must extend to someone who exercises ultimate control. Mr. President, Regulation 18 is being amended to ensure that the duty on reporting entities is also adhered to by overseas branches and subsidiaries where they exist, and that they must be advised of circumstances where they are unable to conform with specified standards and conduct under the Act, as well as, of course, appropriate measures being applied to minimize the risk of terrorism financing posed to regulated businesses. Mr. President, the proposed regulation also seeks to amend paragraph 4, this is again of Regulation 18, by deleting it and stipulating instead that a person who contravenes this regulation commits an offense. If the person is an individual who has been convicted by the parish court, they are liable to a fine not exceeding $3 million or imprisonment, or not more than 3 years, or to both fine and imprisonment. And if convicted by a circuit court, the individual will be liable to pay a fine, of course determined by the court, or be imprisoned for a term of not more than 20 years. Mr. President, in respect of a body corporate, the fine will be not exceeding $5 million, as indicated earlier, and in respect of the circuit court, of course, a fine to be determined there. And as explained, this is in line with POCA. So again, Mr. President, people may say 20 years, but this is about terrorism. It's not about just money. It's about what that money is used for, and it is a part, again, not only of our desire to comply, but it is also part of the role that Jamaica plays in supporting the global fight against terrorism. We often make note of the fact that places in the Caribbean are soft targets because we're not obvious locations for illicit activity. And that's why it makes it even more important for us to make sure that loopholes are plugged, as we would then, of course, be obvious targets for persons looking for places where it is easy to move money illicitly. Mr. President, in respect of the UN Security Council regulations, reporting entities regulations, I will not go through in full detail unless this is the desire of members, because these are, I would want to propose just a bit more clear in terms of how they have been set out, because of the manner of the regulations, not amending earlier regulations. And I just wish to point out, however, that the main obligations under the regulations include identifying assets relating to proliferation financing activities, communicating designations to financial institutions and designated non-financial institutions, and monitoring compliance. The regulations also, Mr. President, include forms, that is the forms for reports pertaining to possession or control of assets owned or controlled on behalf of a proscribed entity. And Mr. President, the regulations also set out the functions that should be carried out by the competent authority and establish the scope of its authority. So, Mr. President, these regulations together are companion regulations to the amendment bills most recently passed and to which I referred earlier. I do hope for the support of my colleagues on both sides in affirming the resolutions which have been tabled. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
President, you recognize me? Yeah. So, President, this opposition is not going to be asking for extended time to review these regulations. So it's not the opposition that would cause it not to go forward on time. However, for the last several weeks, the Senate has been taken up with fulfilling our obligation to the UN and other bodies in respect to these regulations, anti-terrorism. The opposition is opposed to terrorism and gives our support to these measures. The minister sent us last week electronically copies, and so we had more time than the time before. The government knows the timetable for reporting to the UN, and we are offended when the matter comes to the Senate with a rush so that we meet deadlines next week as in the past. It tells me whoever wants to be upset can get upset, but it tells me that the monitoring by the government is not up to speed, because these matters should be dealt with in advance. Take today. Having sent us electronically last week these reports, there's changes that are being made today. So we have been told, for example, that it's no longer money laundering. It's against terrorism financing. Isn't this something that the government ought to have known weeks ago, and not just between last week and today? So we wonder how much attention is being given by the government to these obligations until the 11th hour. They rush to the Senate knowing that some of my colleagues will just rubber stamp anything and not ask questions about the implication of these regulations on the Jamaican people. I raised those concerns not with malicious intent, but to urge the government that when our reporting comes up in February and beyond February, we'll have done the homework long in advance, so we don't have to rush and ask for suspension of standing orders to meet our obligation. That's a concern we have. We support these measures, but we also say to the government, put your house in order so you may do it. I blame not the PS. I leave that for the Growth Council people to wrongfully blame the PS, because we don't think we should wrongfully blame the PS. We support the civil servants. President, when I spoke the last time about these regulations and our international obligation, I made certain comments. The minister took offense to it. She said, yeah man, about instructions. I am happy that the Prime Minister spoke in the other place about Jamaica's sovereignty and who takes the decision. I am happy that Minister of Agriculture and the many things that Audley Shaw spoke about it. Minister, the courage to stand up for Jamaica and against bullies is what we expect from our Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Prime Minister and Minister Shaw a safe grace. I hope that someday you won't blame the media for raising what is a legitimate question. The media for raising what is a legitimate question about interference in the domestic affairs of the people of Jamaica. May it please you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I know that the Jamaica people watch me stand up to a bully every Friday. So I know that they have absolutely no
That's on a point of order. That's on a point of order. That's on a point of order. If raising legitimate questions in the Senate makes me a bully in her eye, I proudly wear that label.
So, anyway, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President,
I assure you,
Mr. President,
Senator Brown, 1 minute, Minister. Senator Brown, I assure you that had the minister indicated that she was referring to any specific member, least of all you, I would have called her to order.
Thank you, Mr. President. All I say is that I understand a coward when I see and hear one.
And you don't call the name either. Can we move on, please, Minister?
Yes, Mr. President. And because I am trying to be extra helpful today, I will also point out, in addition to my information on the principle of collective responsibility, I will also explain that the trip to China was an official visit of the Prime Minister, and it was therefore appropriate that he be the one who delivered the statement on China. No, Mr. President, so that having been clarified, because, and for those listening as well as those who are present today, because I know the question had been asked. The Leader of Opposition Business had in fact asked whether I would speak on that matter, and I had indicated that the Prime Minister would deliver this statement as was appropriate. But, Mr. President, I ask, but I ask, in light of there being no opposition, that the resolution be affirmed.
Thank you very much, Minister. And you have heard the proposal concerning the Terrorism Prevention Reporting Entities Amendment Resolution 2019 and United Nations Security Council Resolution Implementation Act. Those in favor? Aye. Against?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, we would now move to the Integrity Commission Remuneration of Commissioners Resolution 2019, which was approved by the Lower House on November 19, approved in that other place, pardon me, on November 19th. Mr. President, as this Senate will recall, the responsibilities of the former Corruption Prevention Commission, the former Office of the Contractor General, and the former Integrity Commission were consolidated into the Integrity Commission, and we'll just refer to it as a commission now, which was established pursuant to Section 5 of the Integrity Commission Act 2017. And the consolidation created one single institution through which anti-corruption efforts would be coordinated to enhance compliance of parliamentarians, public officers, and public bodies in the execution of public functions. The Commission has a mandate to investigate alleged or suspected acts of corruption and instances of non-compliance with provisions of the Act, to prosecute acts of corruption and offences committed under the Act, and to receive statutory declarations submitted by parliamentarians and public officials relating to their assets, liabilities, and income. Mr. President, the Commission is also responsible for developing its strategic direction and supporting policies in keeping with the requirements of the Act. Mr. President, Section 8.1 of the Act provides for the membership of the Commission to comprise the Auditor General and 4 other persons appointed by the Governor General by instrument in writing after consultation with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. The Senate will also recall that in the exercise of his powers under Section 8, the Governor General appointed the following members of the Commission with effect from February 23, 2018. The Honourable Justice Carl Harrison, retired, CD Chairman, the Honourable Justice Seymour Panton, retired, OJCD, Mr. Eric Crawford, CD, Mr. Derek McCoy, CDJP, and Mrs. Pamela Monroe Ellis, Auditor General, FCCACA. The last 4, of course, were members, and the first was a chair, Mr. President. The Senate will also recall that Justice Carl Harrison resigned as chairman of the Commission with effect August 31, 2019. And it should be noted, Mr. President, that the Commission has convened approximately 22 meetings since its establishment and has been working to resolve complaints and investigations which predated its establishment, while also overseeing the operational merger of the entities and establishing new policies and procedures to guide the work of the Commission. So a significant body of work is being done, Mr. President. In furtherance of this work, the Commission has established 5 subcommittees, namely 1, the Information and Complaints Committee, 2, the Investigations Committee, 3, the Corruption Prosecution Committee, 4, an Audit and Finance Committee, and 5, an Internal Affairs Committee. And each subcommittee is chaired by a member of the Commission, Mr. Chairman. And I should just indicate, Mr. Chairman, although I know the senators are aware, that the Honourable Justice Panton has been subsequently appointed as chair, and Justice Hibbert has been appointed as a member to fill the vacancy created when the chairman resigned. Mr. President, in respect of the remuneration structure with which we're treating today, while Section 22 of the Act provides that there shall be paid from the funds of the Commission to the chairman and other commissioners such remuneration by way of honorarium, salary, or fees, and such allowances as may be approved by the resolution of the House of Representatives and Senate respectively. Unlike other acts which establish commissions of Parliament, the Act is silent on the rate by which the commissioners are to be remunerated, the rate at which, not by, and thereby requiring a policy decision to be taken to specify the fee structure and rates at which the commissioners are now to be compensated. So the Senate, of course, would note that membership of the Commission included 2 persons who were being remunerated as salaried officers of the government of Jamaica. So these were the former chairman, who is a member of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, and therefore being compensated at the rate equivalent to a puisne judge, and the Auditor General, who is, of course, the head of the Auditor General's Department. So the Government of Jamaica policies and procedures, Mr. President, preclude payment of more than 1 salary from the public purse to any individual. But based on the consultations with the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, it was confirmed that there was a need for an appropriate fee structure to be designed for payment to the commissioners, given the significant work which they do. In keeping with the directive of the Cabinet, the Ministry developed a fee structure for payment to members of the Integrity Commission with effect from the 23rd of February 2018, that is the date on which members were appointed, and with effect from February 23rd, 2019, where a slight increment was given in accordance with other increments that were provided. Mr. President, it should be noted that the Ministry of Finance, in arriving at the proposed fees, took into account the frequency of meetings, the fact that commissions of Parliament are usually paid higher rates than boards of directors, and that recommended remuneration resembled the current remuneration of the Industrial Disputes Tribunal, so they use them as a proxy. So the Senate is being advised that commissioners have not received remuneration for their services since appointment, Mr. President, and so we must really thank them for the incredible work that they have been doing since their appointment in February, while the nuts and bolts have been sorted out. Definitely these are persons of just unimpeachable integrity, strength of character, and devotion to country, that this period of time would have passed, and they have, without murmur, really been doing not only the work that was handed to them, but the new work of creating this new institution. So in this context, Mr. President, and in our desire not to delay any further any inhibitors to providing them with remuneration, I ask members to support the resolution tabled.
Mr. President? Mr. President?
Sorry, Senator Fraser-Binns or Senator Morris?
I will give it to my leader, sir. Go ahead? Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we on this side
Sorry, Senator Fraser-Binns.
Thank you, sir. We support this resolution that is before us. Mr. President, I'm very pleased, Minister, that you spoke to the 2 salary, because that was... Yes, Minister, I'm very, very pleased that you spoke to the issue of 2 salary, because that was a discussion that was had in terms of how do you treat with that. I also noticed that you stated that the salary is comparable to that which is received at the IDT, but at another place where some persons in here sit, I do know that the salary, and I'm not even looking anywhere, Mr. President, but I do know that the salary is, at that place, is a little bit higher than this. But I'm quite sure that Senator Skeffrey would not want me to delve too much into the difference in the payment structure. But Mr. President, I said that only because of Senator Skeffrey. you know, Mr. President, Senator Webby has really been behaving himself today, you know. I think it is Senator Skeffrey who drew him out this time. Mr. President, I have had occasions to deal with the staff at the Integrity Commission, and I must praise their level of professionalism. And while I can't speak definitively to their compensation, and while we on this side support the resolution before us, I am hopeful, Minister, that the compensation to the actual staff themselves is something that the ministry, but the government in due course will address to ensure that they're properly remunerated, that issues of job security is dealt with at the soonest, because we know that having come over and the merger pursuant to the Integrity Commission Act, there are still administrative issues that have to be resolved. And I'm hopeful, but I'm hoping that in very short order that those issues will be resolved so that staff members will be secured. You see, the work of the Integrity Commission is so important, particularly in our society where there is, regrettably, this perception of corruption and lack of trust. And I believe that as the government, including the opposition and the government itself, we have to provide the necessary resources so that the Integrity Commission can do its work to instill or to recreate confidence in Jamaicans that public servants and politicians are persons who execute their work with credibility, and that we can recreate that trust. I have spoken to the members on this side, and I think that we all support this. We have no reservation in this regard, and I know that Senator Brown will have a few words to say. But that being said, we support the resolution.
Thank you very much, Senator Fraser-Bin. Senator Morris.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to join with and agree with Senator Fraser-Bin that we on this side fulsomely support the resolution for the remuneration for the commissioners of the Integrity Commission. And, you know, I mean, I really want to also endorse the sentiment expressed that the individuals who have offered themselves to serve our country, they have done so, and they are individuals with the highest repute and integrity. And, you know, it is manifested, and I can legitimately say, Senator Webby, that they have, the mere fact that they have worked for over a year without collecting a cent, a dime, and not murmured and mumbled, is a testimony of the character of the individuals that are there at the organization. So, you know, no one is questioning that. I have a concern, Mr. President, because, and it's nothing fundamental, I just note that in the resolution, it cited figure, an annual figure, as against a fee for attendance of meetings. So I'm wondering if this is this a salaried position, or is it a fee, and why is it structured the way how it is structured? That is something that I would want to get some clarity on, because I generally when you say a fee, Senator Webby, there is a set rate for attending meetings. But how it is structured here in the resolution is an annualized figure, which means that irrespective of the individual attending meetings or so forth, that is the figure that they will receive. So I just wanted to get some clarity on that, Minister. May it please you, and I fulsomely support the resolution.
President, I rise again, and I expect you to recognize me.
Thank you, Senator Morris. Senator Brown.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, one of the biggest issues in the country today is the fight against corruption. We passed a legislation a year plus ago appointing people as commissioners, but we put no arrangement in place for them to be remunerated. Not until their annual report in July this year did it come to light that they are working like Ali Button, working for nothing. And again, whether collectively or as government, we pass new legislation, but the enforcement, the implementation of the legislation shows deficiency. Not trying to beat up the government on that, not trying to bully the government on that, just simply saying, Senator Webby, it's our obligation when we pass legislation. Then we're picking up on you today. It's because we haven't seen you for a little while. It is our obligation that when we pass legislation, we ensure the mechanism of implementation, of enforcement is in place. Otherwise, the legislations mean very little. But this corruption issue is so great that we say in the legislation that we want people of high caliber, high competence, and I think we reserve it for judges of the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal to sit. And then we turn around and say to them, well, yeah, you're retired, but you have to look at all of these parliamentarians' reports. You have to look at thousands of public sector reports. But we're going to pay you at or around the lower level of the RM, of the parish court, parish judge. I believe, like all workers, Senator Gill, need topping up. The teachers, the police, the civil servants, the janitors, all the workers in the public sector need a topping up. But these are about 5 or so commissioners. We can do better than this. We can do better than this. Court of Appeal judge, former presidents of the Court of Appeal, pay them what is worth, so that they will be the watchdog for us in an efficient way over the corrupt practice of some of our own colleagues. When you pay them this little, it's as if to say, well, I know nothing. Pay people for the job they're doing. This anti-corruption thing is big. Not only that, Mr. President, but the practice of some of the boards we have in government, and we talk about boards, lead to even greater corruption and lead to the Integrity Commission having to go into different agencies to investigate, to receive report, to evaluate the quality of the report, as we saw in the Moon Palace issue. It is important that we take the anti-corruption fight. Recent polls have shown that the people feel that we have become more corrupted in the last 2 years. That's a battle that this government is losing. And when the Prime Minister says it's a learning curve, is this why we're paying them this little? Because it's a learning curve? What learning curve? We have been around the integrity from the 70s. We have been around corruption prevention from the 80s. We have been around the Contractor General from 08 and thereabout. Sorry? Ashton Wright. No Trophy Race is the book he wrote about his experience there. So we have been around these things. So it's not there's no learning curve. We have been there. Learning curve is an excuse. It's an excuse for not stamping out corruption as was promised in that inauguration speech. Learning curve when people have to resign as ministers. What learning curve? This country is tired of the corruption from whichever quarter, whichever administration. We're tired of it because it caused poor people to suffer. It means we can't do the dengue test. We can't fix the roads properly. And in fact, corruption caused the roads to crumble soon after they are fixed. That is the problem. So that when we come to the commissioners, we need to treat them better. Another thing that we need to, that's not corruption, my friend. And don't bring Cavan into it. You just mumble things that you don't know. At this level, you need to rise with things that you know. Mr. President, not answer. We just want to. Mr. President, I want to ask a question. Maybe the minister could. We're paying them this low. Are we giving them medical benefits, insurance? Because I think they deserve it. These people, most of them are at retirement. And the health care is terrible. We need to ensure that they get medical insurance. When we employ people in the private sector, we set out to give them that. You, Senator Gale, and I fight for that everywhere. We should give these people medical insurance too. This is a stressful work. When you look at a report and you look at the name involved in the report, and you have to make a decision having regard to how powerful this name is, that's a stressful work. When they have to hold confidentiality, that's a stressful work. When only a few of them know the darkness that surrounds certain places and activity, we need to treat them better. And as we treat them better, Mr. President, I want to ask of them to do the work effectively, efficiently, and with speed. Because the delay in making reports turn the country against the anti-corruption agencies. Mr. President, there's a single case that I wish the Integrity Commission to deal with. It's a case where the Integrity Commission started an investigation, and a citizen went to court for judicial review, to review whether or not the commission had the authority to investigate the matter that they had set out to do. It was heard in the Supreme Court. Senator Webber, listen to this. It was heard on the 25th of October, 2013. How much years is that now? 6 long years in which a judge reserved judgment. The judge reserved judgment 6 years ago. 6 years ago. On a matter involving the Integrity Commission. It sounds like a preserve for two, my friend. So let me borrow Senator Gill. It seems the judge preserved judgment. And Minister, you may not like this, but the Gleaner did an editorial on the case recently too. When I saw the report in July this year, it jumped out at me. And I'm happy that the Gleaner took it up in an editorial and say, we need action. Senator Charles is a lawyer, Senator Sinclair is a lawyer. 6 years for a decision that the court reserved judgment to tell the Integrity Commission whether or not they have the right in law to pursue the investigation. So that investigation stalled 6 years ago. It is incumbent on the Integrity Commission, even if the pay is not enough, to go to the court and ask for the court to decide. The Chief Justice has assured us swift enforcement of justice, swift implementation of justice. Senator Charles can't be happy that it has taken 6 long years. 6 long years. And the weirdest thing, you know, Mr. President, we might have gotten an eagle case where the judge may now be retired and therefore is not in a position anymore to hand down a judgment. How can we as a government, having read the report, how can we as an opposition, having read the report, remain silent on that report? That's not defending transparency. That's not defending openness. That's sowing the seeds of doubt whether we have the will to pursue the anti-corruption campaign wherever it leads. Minister, you and I don't agree often, but on this I think we can agree. 6 years is too long a time for a judgment to be reserved in a judicial review matter where the issue is corruption. Mr. President, if today, just as I got the minister to move the regulation and the board's issue, maybe my comment today, as I got them to move on the Moon Palace report, maybe my comment today will move them to go to the court to say to the Chief Justice, why are we waiting 6 years? Why the people of Jamaica should wait so long? In other words, people who are accused should be given the opportunity to exonerate themselves. And in this respect, Mr. President, I close by recognizing that your colleague, our colleague, Queen's Counsel Senator K.D. Knight, is not here today because he was engaged in a matter overseas for which he has gotten acquittal of all 15 counts for his client. May it please you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, just allow me just a very few comments in closing. One would be to affirm that the government deeply values the work that is done by the staff, not only at the Integrity Commission, but across the civil service. The work that is done in service of Jamaica and in service of national development is work which we all hope to one day grow to a level of economic prosperity that allows us to pay the full value of this work. You would want to pay your civil servants at the highest level. We share that desire. And that's why we're working so hard at economic growth, at inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And it is why we too share the importance of ensuring that the institutional framework to have a sustainable fight against corruption is also in place, which is where the Integrity Commission fits in. Mr. President, the matter of salaries, I think, is a little delicate to go beyond simply noting that judges who retire retain the salary at which they retire. And while this may depreciate in value over time, it is in fact not one of the less well remunerated members of the public service, in a sense, if you want to think about public servants in the broad overarching. So the Ministry of Finance, I cannot say all of the elements that they took into consideration when they determined the fee to be assigned, but it was thought to be appropriate in light of the work that's being done and in the context of the general remuneration of all public servants. So, Mr. President, I'm pleased to note that there is no objection to the resolution tabled, and in that context, I ask that the resolution be affirmed. There's a question here, with your leave, Mr. President.
Sorry, I'd asked the question about the standardized payment that has been stated in the resolution versus a fee right per meeting, because I mean how it is structured here is that it's a salary which they will get whether or not they attend a meeting or not for the year.
It is a commuted fee, essentially. Given the number of meetings, the number of subcommittee meetings, etc., if you were to pay per meeting, it would in fact become quite astronomical. And what was done in consultation with them as well was a general understanding that this is a heavy body of work. It is continued public service. There are only a few people who can do it, but they are committed to Jamaica, committed to contributing, and they have viewed in the totality of the circumstances, including what they earn otherwise, that this is appropriate and that they are willing to continue in service at this level. So it is not a salary, it is a fee, but it is commuted and annualized for the purposes of greater predictability of the budget assigned to the entity. What you wouldn't want is an entity where 75% of its budget is paid administratively and not to doing all of the work of at the top. So, Mr. President, I have nothing further on this particular matter. I have no details on that. What I have is what I have here. So, thank you, Mr. President, for moving that the motion be affirmed.
The question is, you have heard the Minister put it, that the Integrity Commission Remuneration of Commissioners Resolution 2019 be affirmed. In favor? Aye. Against? Minister?
Mr. President, the matter before us is now the Act to repeal the Minimum Business Tax Act 2019. Senators will recall that the abolition of the minimum business tax was one of the 2019-2020 revenue measures announced earlier this year, and it was part of a broader policy effort to ensure financial inclusion for more Jamaicans and, of course, to encourage the formalization of businesses. Mr. President, small and medium business enterprises have always been a part of the backbone of societies, and they are a big part of this administration's thrust for economic growth and prosperity. The Act to repeal the Minimum Business Tax Act is an important part of this agenda because it reduces disincentives for formalizing business operations, and it makes it easier, Mr. President, to grow. It makes it easier for people to formalize and to lift themselves and their families economically and otherwise. And this is part of the work that we are doing as an administration to make it easier for people to do business, to start and sustain businesses, and to harness the entrepreneurial spirit that Jamaicans do so well. Mr. President, this act is provides us with one more step, one more way, one more hurdle, removes one more hurdle from growing from the informality of the hustle, which we respect, but allow those who want to grow from the hustle into prosperous businessmen and women. The removal of this tax is one of the steps which will assist. So, Mr. President, in carrying through the commitment that was made on the announcement of the measures, the provisional collection of tax, minimum business tax order, had been implemented in order to reduce the rate of the tax to zero, so that the commitment was carried through pending the drafting and tabling and debate on this act that is before us today, the bill before us today. And it now provides the final step, the final nail in the coffin of the minimum business tax, which was introduced in 2014. Mr. President, the tax was a tax of $60,000, and it was imposed on businesses regardless of profitability. It's 2014. 2014. Yes, Mr. President, and without reference to size, notwithstanding that there was a threshold, however, a revenue threshold for it. It was payable in 2 equal installments due on the 15th of June and the 15th of September annually, and a credit could be claimed against income tax liability for the same year of assessment in which business tax was actually paid. Businesses also, Mr. President, had to file 2 returns, because you had to file a return for the minimum business tax and a minimum, and also for income tax. So it was an additional administrative requirement. So, Mr. President, the tax was noted as successful in a reduction of shelf companies, because there's, of course, a proliferation of shelf companies that were not contributing to the revenue at all, but existing, holding up business names, etc. But, Mr. President, it was clearly also criticized for being inequitable, because, of course, it was not based on profitability, and, of course, because it was an overall hindrance to business, Mr. President. I must say that I must emphasize that this measure, among other revenue measures introduced, are geared at stimulating business activity and incentivizing formalization, because that allows and enables growth, Mr. President. The revenue measures were also in keeping with the government's tax reform thrust, and by focusing on the removal of what were viewed as the most distortionary taxes. So, Mr. President, the removal of this tax with which we proceed today and its associated filing requirements will reduce the tax burden on micro and small businesses, but will also allow the country to improve on its doing business World Bank ranking. And this will be particularly in the ease of paying taxes category. Mr. President, I recall when the announcement was made by the Minister of Finance earlier this year, I cannot say the number of former colleague attorneys who had called me to say that, they had persons contact them about winding up businesses, etc., because they thought that it really just did not make sense. It was there were too many burdens. But this was one of the steps, together, of course, with measures in relation to stamp duty and transfer tax, etc., that had made them feel maybe they should continue to try and grow these small businesses that were in their infancy. So I have to say that I have experienced and shared, rather, in the positive approach with or positive welcome that this particular measure has received from the public. and it's therefore a real pleasure to bring it into its final and formal manifestation today. So the bill, Mr. President, is quite simple. It only has 3 clauses, notwithstanding how far-reaching the consequences are. The provisional order, you would recall, was only effective from April 1, 2019. So clause 1(2) actually seeks to eliminate any liability for the whole of 2019. It makes the abolition retroactive to January 1, 2019. Mr. President, clause 2 abolishes the tax entirely, as the provisional order, as I indicated earlier, could only reduce the tax rate to 0, but it had not removed the tax from the roll. Mr. President, the provisional order could also not provide for a refund of tax already paid after the effective date. So clause 3 makes a provision for taxpayers who would have settled their minimum business tax liability during the first 3 months of the year, to commencing on the first day of January 2019, to receive a refund of the tax once, of course, they don't have any arrears. So, Mr. President, it is, of course, important to note that the tax does not relieve liability for taxes not paid for the years of assessment prior to January 1, 2019. There's no relief for the persons who are in arrears, Mr. President, and we call on them, of course, to pay taxes, because this is important and would have been baked into revenue. We anticipate that business people who are earning money and doing well would pay their taxes, and so we hope that they will answer the call. However, we have answered the louder call, which is the call to remove the Minimum Business Tax Act and the hindrance which it is to growth of small businesses. I thank you, Mr. President, as I await the contribution of our colleagues on the other side.
Mr. President, permission to speak from a seat that is not my own.
Thank you very much.
I must.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much, Minister. Senator.
Mr. President, I want to commend the government this has nothing to do with size. This has to do with balance. I mean, many small businesses have complained about this business tax, and quite rightly said, it was a big hindrance to small business activity, as well as how we orchestrate our growth and development pursuits through government fiscal policy. Mr. President, this bill today brings us to the broader notion of how do we use fiscal policy to engineer economic growth and development throughout the country. Fundamentally, we realize that there is always a different tax policy as it relates to large companies, as it relates to companies coming from abroad in the special economic zones, and as it relates to small businesses across the country. Now, whilst each of these represent a significant portion of business activity, and where the world is headed now, small and micro medium enterprises are the backbone of economic growth in many countries, and Jamaica included. One would ask, therefore, why within the special economic zones and the subsidies that are granted to these companies, why many of these subsidies are not geared towards small and medium-sized enterprises who specifically focus on creating value-added output of goods and services for this country. Mr. President, we look at this minimum business tax and we wonder, when will the overall bill be implemented? And we also want to make it known that we want to see this being retroactive. There are many companies who did not pay the business tax because it was cumbersome, There are many companies who have been bombarded by this business tax because they haven't been making any profits, and the marginal costs associated with their production processes have been greater than the marginal revenues, and many of them are in debt. So fundamentally today, once more, we welcome this bill, and we want to see its enactment being retroactive so that companies who currently owe are deleted from the books and don't have to pay anything whatsoever. As well as when we look at subsidizing businesses, we have been having a problem with economic growth in the country. We have grown at an average of 0.7% over the last 50 years. The government is on a thrust to create jobs and also to create growth. But fundamentally speaking, where we are now as a country, we have to move away specifically from job and growth in GDP to creating wealth and to move towards a more developed nation. We have the ability to do so, and through government fiscal policy, not just through taxation policy, but also through the subsidies we offer, we have to make sure that these small and micro enterprises receive the same amount of subsidies like the companies who are a part of the special economic zones. There is no research that shows that these companies from the special economic zones contribute to economic growth or even economic expansion more than small and micro enterprises. As a result, we believe that these small and micro enterprises should receive the bulk of the subsidies. Mr. President, financing for many of these MSMEs has also been a problem, and we propose that we look into using policy to create what we call a nano stock exchange so that these companies can find capital from within themselves and people who don't normally invest in stocks and bonds. This micro or nano stock exchange will be a decent addition to what the Jamaica Stock Exchange already offers in its main and its junior market. I strongly believe that given the nature of how commercial banks have been administering the loans that they offer to these MSMEs, we realize that there are a lot of hindrances that exist that have been preventing these MSMEs from accessing capital, and we believe that if we cannot finance them, then we should allow them to finance themselves through the mobilization of equity financing from people who span this country. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, once more, taxation and subsidies should be used to the benefit not just of large companies but also for small businesses as well.
Mr. President, permission to speak from a seat that is my own. And let me say, Mr. President, I will not be muzzled by any bully. Mr. President, I didn't call any name. Mr. President, I rise in support of the bill shortly entitled An Act to Repeal the Minimum Business Tax Act. Mr. President, based on my recollection, I think it was 2014, 2015, this tax was really a tax measure to collect more taxes to cover the fiscal deficit at the time. I guess at the time, Senator Brown and Senator Skeffrey, one may argue that it was intended also not to enhance the tax collection, but also to broaden the tax base. And I will speak to broadening the tax base later in my presentation. Mr. President, my problem with this tax, and it has always been, is that you are really taxing the company, even if the company is making a significant loss or if they are going through cash flow problems. To put it another way, Mr. President, you're really taxing the small man even before he gets his business started. So I would like to really use this opportunity to commend the Minister of Finance for delivering on this commitment to have this tax measure repealed. Mr. President, for many years, Jamaicans we have had continuous imposition of new tax packages. And it was really heartwarming. It was really heartwarming, Senator Hill. For the first time, a Minister of Finance was able to announce a net tax reduction in Jamaica. And I want to support the leader. I want to support the leader that this bill actually forms part of a policy decision which will abolish taxes that do not support economic activity. As said earlier by Senator Haughton and our leader, SMEs are so important for the future of economic growth. And Senator Brown, the data is there to support it. SMEs on a global basis actually represents about 90% of all businesses and more than 50% of employment worldwide. And if you look at the data, formal SMEs actually contribute 40% of the national income, GDP, in emerging economies. In addition, if you look at the World Bank report, by 2030, SMEs will employ about 600 million people. In fact, if you look at the data closely, SMEs create 7 out of 10 jobs. So we have no doubt that this move is to unlock growth in our economy. Mr. President, as a country, we must create an economic environment in which SMEs will be able to grow into big companies listed on the Jamaica Stock Exchange and exporting to the world. This has not been said, but if you look at the calculation closely, Senator Charles, what this is really doing is that SMEs will collectively retain over $1 billion in their treasury. $1 billion. They are retaining it instead of paying out in taxes. And I would like to encourage all SMEs that are retaining this $1 billion collectively to use that savings very carefully and prudently. For example, reinvest in capital in your business. Reinvest in technology in the business. Reinvest in innovation in the business. Reinvest in proper systems and control in your business. Use the savings to reinvest in your business. And I also note that the Small Business Association of Jamaica has described this tax as a burden to small businesses. So today we can say no more to the small businesses. Mr. President, my colleague Senator Haughton spoke about taxes. And this is something, Senator Haughton, that you know that I think both of us are passionate about from the Private Sector Economic Policy Committee. When we speak about a tax system, we must have a tax system, first of all, that is predictable, that is broad-based, and most of all, must be equitable for good economic growth. Tax reform is not a project, it's a process. It must continue as we move along. And I would say there are significant opportunities in Jamaica to broaden the tax net and make it more fair and equitable to all. This report is dated, but I think it is still relevant to quote in this Honourable House. And it's a report from the Inter-American Development Bank. And I want to share it to this Honourable House and my colleague senators. 1% of corporations in Jamaica pay 71% of the corporate income tax collected. 1% of registered entities account for 60% of PAYE collected. 1% of corporations pay 58% of GCT collected. And 40% of economic activity, 40% Senator Hill, of economic opportunity is unregistered. Mr. President, my view is that longer-term strategic approaches for tax policy making will have more impact than short-term measures. In general, measures that broaden the tax base are growth-enhancing and sustainable because they reduce the scope of tax-driven economic distortions and special treatment for certain groups of taxpayers. They also help to limit the size of the informal economy, which is our ultimate objective, which otherwise reduces the tax that can significantly undermine tax morale and compliant taxpayers. It was touched on earlier, Mr. President, and this is my final point I'd like to make as it relates to tax compliance. The Doing Business report for 2020 ranks Jamaica at 124 out of 190 economies for ease of paying taxes, and I can say that is nothing to be proud of. If you look at the report very closely, paying taxes is measured by the amount of payments, time, and total contribution rate for a firm to comply with all tax regulations, as well as posting or filing returns. Listen to this, my colleagues, senators, and Mr. President. It takes on an average 268 hours for a firm to complete the tax payment processes. Can you imagine that the impact that has on productivity? A firm, 268 hours to complete the tax payment processes. Can you imagine, Senator Hill, the medium-sized companies? Can you imagine the small businesses? Can you imagine the impact on our country in terms of productivity when you're spending 268 hours to file your tax returns? Mr. President, a joint PwC World Bank report accepted that tax systems will need to change. It is suggested that the measures that simplify the tax code, for example, by moving to a flatter rate structure, make it easier for taxpayers to understand and contribute and help the system to be fair and legitimate. If tax reforms, Senator Brown, are poorly designed, there's a risk they will leave taxpayers feeling frustrated, potentially discouraging them from engaging positively with the tax system and increasing the risk of less than full compliance. As said earlier, Mr. President, sustained focus on technology, making taxes significantly easier. There is still scope, I think, to improve the availability and tax up of online systems for filing and paying taxes in Jamaica. What we need, Mr. President and colleagues, in terms of the online system, we need a very, very focused campaign, very focused education for these small businesses to feel comfortable with the online system so they will use it. So I am recommending that a comprehensive training program be put in place for small businesses to feel comfortable with the online system. And I will say that 268 hours will be reduced significantly if we can achieve that objective. So as a country, Mr. President and colleagues, we really need to continuously explore ways to leverage the use of technology, which will encourage tax compliance and participation. Mr. President, in closing, I want to again offer my support for this bill and really congratulate the Minister of Finance for executing on his promise made earlier this year. I thank you, sir.
Mr. President, I rise to...
One minute, please. Thank you, Senator Webby. Senator Fraser-Binns, you need the lectern?
No, sir.
Oh, happy to hear.
I rise to make a very brief intervention with this bill. And I do so as someone who is the S in the SME. I do have a very small firm, and I completely understand the economic challenge. No, not medium, really small. And I do understand the financial challenge that a tax like this posed. And so I am pleased with the debate that is happening today. Mr. President, I heard the minister when she says that those who owe should pay, and I completely agree. But I would want to put to you for consideration that Senator Haughton mentioned it, that this bill really should be retroactive, because it is my belief that the majority of those who have not been in compliance are because they simply could not have complied. And especially in an era where companies were forced between paying their dues or keeping staff, and it is public information that so many companies, so many small and medium-sized companies were forced to become creative in terms of how they treat their staff. So you have situations where instead of laying off staff, companies decided to reduce their work days to 2 days or 3 days or a couple of hours. And so, you know, in that spirit of creativity, I believe that the government collectively should give further consideration to some of those small, medium-sized enterprises. And I ask you, Minister, I know it can't be amended today, but certainly where you sit, for that sentiment to be shared with the members of your executive. The other thing as well, and I think it's important for us to reflect, because we are commending the government on making a promise and staying true to the promise. But I think that as a country, we must also consider and reflect on the reason why in 2014 it was felt that such a tax had to be imposed. We must never forget the financial and economic condition of the country, and the fact that the government of the day felt that in order to move the country forward, this was a necessary step. A step which was never intended to be a long-term step. It was really intended to be a holding mechanism so that we could put ourselves together, so to speak, and steady that sinking ship. So I'm raising it. And I'm raising it, Senator Hill. One, because we must never forget the past. But secondly, it is important that as a country, we manage our affairs so that we never get back there, where we feel that such a tax or any similar tax has to be imposed. I'm going to disagree with you, but I'm not going to have a debate, because there are signs that we're not managing how we should be managed. But that's for another discussion. But Mr. President, I want to say that certainly on this side, we support the bill because it bears fruit, or it bears true to the intent at the time of formulation. And I also ask that we do not shower ourselves with accolades to the detriment of learning from the past, so that we can influence in a positive. No, they should not. Right. Shower yourselves with accolades so that you do not learn from the past to influence in a positive way the future for the benefit of Jamaica. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Fraser-Binns. President General, Senator Gale.
Mr. President, thank you, sir. Mr. President, I want to start by indicating my full support for the intent of this bill. You know, in his maiden budget speech, Minister Nigel Clark did something that no other finance minister, certainly in my living memory, had done. He announced a reduction in taxes of some $14 billion Never in history. And for many years, taxpayers have been burdened with taxes and even new taxes annually. The previous minister bucked that trend when he announced that no new taxes would have been required. Mr. President, I want to use this opportunity to commend successive government administration for the fiscal discipline. The role of EPOC in that. But I also want to acknowledge the sacrifice of public sector workers and their trade unions that made, and the JDX and NDX, that made us where we are. This government, Mr. President, is clearly focused on the need for Jamaica to pursue growth and equity, and the urgent need to achieve economic independence. And while we must exploit economic opportunities, I want to remind us that we must always protect the vulnerable and the poor. And if we continue on this trajectory, we can reduce our debt to GDP ratio substantially within a few years. So I'm confident that we are managing, and we are managing exceptionally well. Mr. President, in his budget presentation, he strategically focused on taxes that were perceived as nuisance, particularly to the small and medium-term enterprise sector, as well as taxes and duties that hampered economic activities. And I wish to hasten to point out some of those measures. The minister spoke of the increase in GCT threshold moving from 3 million to 10 million. He spoke of major stamp duty reduction, transfer tax reduction, transfer tax threshold for estates, the partial abolition of asset tax, and today, promise made, promise kept, the abolition of the minimum business tax. Mr. President, it was a disincentive to dormant companies and struggling small businesses. This may encourage small business now to enter the market and further create more employment opportunities. It is certainly going to reduce the cost for small businesses and medium and micro enterprise. Mr. President, I did indicate when I spoke in this parliament during the appropriations bill that the companies must exploit this abolition and use it to their advantage. Use it to their advantage. This minimum business tax came about as an effort to collect taxes from those who are not filling the net. And I'm sure that TAJ can find creative ways to ensure compliance. So they must exploit it. Senator Webby spoke about using the funds available now to re-engineer, to restructure your operations. And so this opportunity, Mr. President, must not be wasted by these small and medium-term enterprises. But, Mr. President, whilst we're on the business of the abolition of taxes, sir, I wish to direct the minister's attention to a tax that I spoke about in this parliament. The tax on concessionary loans for workers in the finance industry. Mr. President, that tax measure was introduced back in 1992 by that administration as a revenue earning measure incorporated to finance the then budget. And the tax is calculated on savings in interest enjoyed by employees of financial institutions who benefit from loans granted at concessionary rates. These interest savings are considered to be the difference between the concessionary rates granted by the institutions and the open market rate. The last adjustment to the provision was to move the threshold from 1.5 million to 4 million and reduce the interest rate from 14% to 9% in December 2014. Yes. But currently, sir, the financial institutions and their workers are at a significant disadvantage relative to the employees in other sectors who are not taxed or on discounts or concessions that they receive from their employees. So these groupings of employees, once they apply for loans and access to credit, they are being taxed, and it's a major disincentive for these workers. And in keeping with a welcome stabilization in our economy and a sustained downward trajectory of interest rates, certainly, sir, below the 9%, because interest rates are now trending down on a weighted average of between 3.5 to 4%, while these workers administered under this piece of taxation are being treated still at 9%. So, Mr. President, if this piece of legislation is taken away as a part of the taxation, it would be welcomed by the workers in the financial industry. Welcome. And I asked the minister to revise it. In fact, knowing very well that I would have made this representation, I wrote to the minister this morning making that request. And sir, it is a request that is fully supported and endorsed by the Jamaica Bankers Association, which includes my colleague on the right. Mr. President, I'm just simply saying that we must take these small measures in removing taxations that have created an albatross around businesses and employees. May it please you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, if you could lift your head from the laptop, you will see me.
Senator Brown, under no condition, even if I was blind, I would be able to see you.
Well, Senator Morris sees me all the time.
Senator Gale, thank you so much. And Senator Brown.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise to recognize that a commitment which our government gave to remove the minimum business tax is being implemented 3 years after this government came to power. It was introduced in 2014. The election was 2016. If it was not necessary, your government would have removed it from 2016. But it was necessary. It was necessary because the country had to be stabilized, arising from the deficit we found in 2011. We came to power in the election of 29 December 2011, and in early 2012 we formed the government. We were faced then with a country on the brink of bankruptcy, a country in which nobody wanted to lend us money or to work with us. We had to pull it up by our own bootstraps, and tough measures had to be taken. And this country owes a debt of gratitude to Prime Minister Portia Simsimila and Minister of Finance Dr. Peter Phillips, as well as the U.S. Congressional Black Caucus. I was happy to hear the Prime Minister praising them the other day, but not because they came to his help. They came to Portia's help and to Peter's help at that time. They came to Jamaica's help. That is true. But so when I hear him praise them, I welcome him to recognize him. Because, Mr. President, during the period when we're trying to stabilize the economy, to bring the recovery, several tax measures had to be taken. Among them was a proposal to introduce a $1 tax out of every $1,000 spent by credit card. Yeah. And the credit cards weren't being spent by the poor people in the society. They were being spent by those higher up in the society. It was a measure to tax the higher up, to ease the poor. The PSOJ was opposed to that $1 out of every $1,000 spent on credit card tax. So the PSOJ proposed to the government the minimum business tax. Well, your ignorance is not my responsibility. Yeah, 120.
Mr. President, the time being 1:20, might standing orders be suspended to permit the Senate to sit beyond 1:30 to complete the business of the day?
The motion is that we should suspend the standing orders so we can finish the business of the day. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Chair. President. So I repeat, the private sector organization of Jamaica, and the private sector in general, suggested to the government that instead of going for the $1 out of every 1,000 credit card spend, that we put in the minimum business tax. It wasn't that we were wicked and we were anti-business, but the business people themselves say, don't tax us when we buy the whiskey with the credit card. Don't tax us when we buy the luxury goods with the credit card. Tax the small business people because too many of them were in the informal sector. You, Senator Webber, spoke about 40% informal. That's the advice of the private sector. Tax those people with the minimum business tax. But we gave a commitment that that wouldn't be an eternal tax, that would take it off as soon as we could. Well, the government changed in 2016, and it has taken you 3 years to take it off. 3 years to take it off. Now, Mr. President, we're taking it off, and we have no problem with that. But my issue is our tax policy. In 2017, the 31st of March, I moved a resolution in the Senate asking for us to discuss a comprehensive review of our tax system. That's what I asked for. And I said further, be it further resolved that the review involve participation from a broad cross-section of stakeholders, including persons representing the interests of those sections of the population who will be adversely affected by the increased indirect taxation. And I call for that to happen. My friend, Senator Matthew Samuda, has publicly said he supports the call. 3 times? I don't want it to sound like 3 times, like in another place somebody said, boy, denial. But I know you have supported this. And I urge the leader of government business to bring this resolution forward. So we may, as a part of the parliament, discuss how we can involve the broad cross-section of the people in tax policy. So what we've been getting, Mr. President, what we've been getting is selective thing. Stamp duty, transfer tax. And the minister says, oh, my lawyer friends are happy. You know who's not happy? The students who must go to TST and buy a patty. You know who not happy? The workers who must go to TST and buy a patty. Because this week, Monday gone, TST increased the price of their patties. So while you are talking glorious macroeconomic numbers, we're talking about, Senator Gill, the fixed income worker, the worker who gets no increase, the 78% of the workforce who are at minimum wage or just above minimum wage, who must face the increase in patty. Mr. President, not only patty went up this week, but the price of gasoline went up this week. And that reminds me that when this government came to power on the 3rd of March 2016, a litre of 87 octane gasoline was for $83.70 ex-refinery price. So let me repeat. When they came to power, they found gas at $83.70 ex-refinery price from Petrojam. In November 2019, the ex-refinery price, we're not talking about adding on the markup yet, and dealer thing, is $129.41. That's a significant, probably 55% increase over the 4 years. Well, 3+ years. That's a significant increase. How does the worker on a fixed income survive that? So talk nice if you want about how things going good in the economy. But the poor worker, the unemployed, the small business people not feeling that prosperity because prices are going up on them. That's the reality. So the government has been quick to give relief to those who can face the increases. But what they have done is haven't given back to the poor anything. Year 1.5, Mr. President. The bulk is that Senator Abraham over right? Year 1.5 recognize that the bulk of the workforce were already below the tax threshold. Below the tax threshold because we're a low-wage society, and below the tax threshold because the previous PNP government had increased the threshold over 3 or 4 times in the last administration. Those are some realities that we must face. And so, Mr. President, having recognized that this minimum business tax was introduced against the background I outlined, I wish to remind the government that those small business people who paid taxes could treat the minimum business tax as a tax credit. So they weren't paying it, Senator Webby, you're not here, but they weren't doubling up. But it was to encourage some people who wasn't paying any taxes to pay their fair share rather than burden the poor with more taxes. That's the reality that we face. So, Mr. President, what we face today, as the minister said, is the response to the loudest cry. She said they are responding to the loudest cry. What a government that cares for the people do is response to the most vulnerable, the poor, the working people, and give them real relief.
Not the nice.
Not the loudest nice, but to those who deserve it the most, the poor. That is what was necessary. What the loudest cry gets is a runaway dollar. A runaway dollar where the bankers, with their big profit, enjoys more profit from manipulating the dollar. But the working people suffer from high prices. And when the dollar rolls back, Mr. President, the prices don't come back. And when the government fails to meet 5 and 4, they don't look at their failed policies. They attack the permanent secretaries in government and the civil servants. And this government has not come out fulsomely in support of the civil servants because your friends, you can't face your friend in the face and say, your 5 and 4 has failed. Don't blame the public sector workers. Mr. President, let us be clear. We are told that these tax measures, this tax relief to those who can afford it, is intended to stimulate growth in the economy. Let's look at the numbers. When the Minister of Finance spoke earlier this year in the budget, Senator Gale, and you quoted him, he said we would have grown 1.5%. So the measures he was introducing to give back to those who can afford it would lead to 1.5% growth. What is the reality? The minister has wheeled and come to us and say, sorry, you're not going to get the 1.5% growth. You're going to go down back to 0.5. So the measures and the tax give back to those who can afford it is not stimulating growth because it is the government numbers that is 0.5 after all the give back, after all the bubble up, as the minister said, all the bubble up. The growth is not bubbling up, the growth is sliding down like a cow tail. The growth is sliding down like a cow tail. It's going down like a cow tail. So, what we're seeing here, the only thing is bubbling up is poverty, as in the 2017 report. The only thing bubbling up is the prices and the poor people. I'm not seeing the growth. And it is in this context, Mr. President, in order to relieve the pressure on the poor, that the leader of the opposition has made bold to say, let us review the GCT rate. Our government moved it from 17.5 down to 16.5. It has stayed at 16.5% for too long. The leader of the opposition recently declared that we should look to moving it down another 2% from 16.5 to 14.5. That is a move to help the poor people. Because when that move down, the prices of goods and service to the people will fall. And therefore they will have more money to spend on other things to stimulate the economy and to get the growth we're looking for. It is not the first time Sunday gone that the leader called for this. Dr. Peter Phillips made that call sitting where Senator Haughton is, in the other place, during the budget presentation. And that was not only a rollback we called for. We called for a rollback on the gas tax. Yes. We called for a rollback on the $7 per litre that was put on by this government to pay partly for the 1.5. So, and plus the $7 for the edge, which you no longer edge. So it's $14 out of the tax price that you are responsible for in taxing the people of the country. Well, let me make it clear. In 2016, I said, 87 octane was $83.70 per litre. In November this year, it is $129.41. What a difference! A difference contributed in a big part by $14 per litre of taxes imposed and maintained by this government. Time to give the poor people a real break. Time to discuss a comprehensive tax review. And the Gleaner this morning's editorial called for it. Time to debate the motion I submitted in 2017. You see, your problem is you believe in Duppy's story. That's the problem. Ghosts are Duppy, you know. So you believe in Duppy's story. The reality is, that's why I'm not cussing the press so much. That's why I'm not cussing the press so much. The reality is, the Gleaner got it right. We need a comprehensive tax review. Senator Webby spoke about him sitting on a review committee with Senator Haughton. That's where we need to go. Involve the people. Which are the taxes going to encourage us to grow better? Because the bubble up theory of the minister not showing up in a growth. And in fact, if you want to talk about bubble, given to the sector that he gave that $14 billion to, that's where the U.S. crisis started in 2008, when there was a bubble in the market. And we have to be careful that we are not feeding that bubble. And when the house crumbles, the people will be asked again to make the sacrifice. Senator Gill, last Friday, representative from your union and other unions in the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Union met with the governor of the Bank of Jamaica to discuss the impact of the sliding dollar on prices. One of the suggestions made in that meeting is for the government to give starting resources to look not just on inflation in general, which takes the average between what Senator Hill eats and the man who sweep up my office. That average is a false average because it distorts the reality. But the suggestion came, Mr. President, that we should ask Statin to develop an index that covers what the people at the bottom of the society, the lower quintiles, is expending dollars on. Because while some of us may not spend 60-70% on food, that's what the poor is spending. So when we calculate their spend on food at 37 and change percent, we're getting the wrong results. It allows us to gloat about macroeconomic numbers, but it doesn't face the reality that patty price gone up, that the taxi man gas gone up, The motorist gas gone up. And the teacher is stressed because her gas price gone up and the students are unruly. Toxic mix. Toxic mix. And so the nurse too. The doctors too in the public sector. The police on the road. And that toxic mix is not good for the society. It's leading to too much rage. Too much rage in the society. Be it in the roads, be it in the schools, be it in the hospitals. Your pretty looks. Your pretty looks. Your pretty looks. Because you say, we don't get none and it done. Your pretty looks, Senator Pretty Looks. That's why I like Teddy Lee, you know. Teddy Lee describe your Senator Pretty Looks. So, Mr. President, I must confess that the Prime Minister, in his boring speech on Sunday, sought to address the social malaise. He sought to address this issue where the society is falling apart. We can turn our eyes to it. And it's under his leadership indeed. We can turn away our face, you know. But the reality is, things not pretty. The prosperity promise is not there. This minimum business tax, yes, we're happy to remove it. We support the removal, albeit it has taken you 3 years to get to that point. For us, Mr. President, I want to join Senator Cavan Gill in his call for review of the tax on the workers in the financial institution in respect to loan. But there's another matter in which himself and I agree. It is about the tax on uniform and laundry. That has remained the same for many years. From the previous administration, the administration before that, and the administration before that. And it is time to give those workers a relief. Don't just rush to give the loudest voice, Minister.
Senator Brown,
yeah.
Remember you have a State of the Nation thing coming up, you know, so don't
Mr. President, we're talking about the minimum business tax.
Don't talk about everything. Deal with
Mr. President, I don't touch corruption yet. I don't touch crime yet. I don't touch the dengue yet. So I have a lot more to come. What I want to focus on is the minimum business tax that you're giving up and where your priority is. And where your priorities. So, for those workers, Senator Gill, I hope your voice will sound loud, if not loudest, over there. And on this side, the bully the minister sees will be shouting loudly on behalf of the poor Jamaican workers. Ease off the tax of our laundry and our uniform. And if you want to keep the tax, increase the threshold. Increase the threshold so we can get more. That's our view to stimulate the economy, to give the poor a chance. This idea of bubbling up for the rich, bubbling up for the wealthy, cannot take our country, a country with great inequality, forward. If we're going to cut those inequality, we must address our tax relief to the poorest among us, to the unemployed, to those outside the labor force unable to find a work. That's what we should do. In fact, Mr. President, that's what the vice of Bustamante ought to be telling them to do. That's what the vice of Ushera ought to be telling them to do. Because on our side, Michael Manley, PJ Patterson, Portia Simpson is saying to us, more need to be done for the poor. May it please you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. Are you finished? You finished your presentation, Senator Brown, or are you still talking there? Thank you very much, Senator Sinclair. Go ahead.
Mr. President, I stand in full support of this bill which seeks to repeal the minimum business tax. Mr. President, when you look at the Memorandum of Objects and Reasons, which states that the decision to abolish the minimum business tax is a means to incentivize the formalization of business activities, reducing the cost of micro and small businesses in order to encourage increased risk-taking business activities by micro and small entrepreneurs, and generally to contribute to a stimulation of business and economic activity and economic growth. Mr. President, those reasons in the memorandum would say to all of us that support has to be given to this repeal. Mr. President, as history would have recorded, this tax was imposed by the previous administration in 2014. At that time, the architect of the measure was then Minister of Finance, now Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Peter Phillips. Mr. President, this tax was imposed on businesses and individuals without any regard to whether they made profit or what their circumstances were. Even dormant businesses, Mr. President, were not spared. And when you give consideration to the fact that many persons use companies for even planning how they would plan their estates, placing property that they would have acquired or received through whatever means into a company for the purpose of avoiding certain taxes upon death, then, for the imposition of the minimum business tax, even on those, one would have found it to be oppressive, Mr. President. Mr. President, today, because of this minimum business tax and the attendant interest and penalties that would have been assessed for late or non-payment, many businesses and individuals are severely indebted to the tax collector. And when I look on the clause 3 of this particular bill, which allows for a refund but can only take us back to January, and I've heard the comments from Senator Haughton where I asked for it to be looked on retroactively. Well, I believe the minister has already addressed that, and circumstances and would not allow for that. But then there are other things that persons can do in respect to seeking relief, at least in relation to interest, and I suppose those can be looked at. Well, Mr. President, it boggled the mind of many persons trying to understand which policymaker could have conceived this draconian tax, much less to implement same, and to do so in spite of the objections and concerns which was raised by the Jamaica Labour Party opposition at the time in the lower house and in this chamber. Mr. President, the Honourable Peter Phillips, then Minister, and his colleagues failed to heed the calls of the opposition and the people of Jamaica at the time they implemented this particular tax. So today, Mr. President, is a day that all well-thinking Jamaicans should take note. Yeah. This administration has heard the cry of the people. Yeah. This administration has a better understanding of the environment. This administration, Mr. President, is formally doing away with this tax measure, which was a disincentive and a wicked burden to taxpayers. Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, I heard one member of the opposition. I heard one member of the opposition in the lower house, and I heard it today from members on the other side, saying that the minimum business tax was never meant to be a permanent tax. Mr. President, I have searched, done research, asked questions, and you know, Mr. President, my research has not revealed any such comment, whether from the Minister of Finance, then Peter Phillips, or any member of the Senate, nor any member of the Senate. So I'm going to ask them, because they have stated it today, I will ask them to just direct us to where it is that was stated, Mr. President. Where, you know, strange enough, when I went and I did some research on the imposition of this tax, what was found commenting from Senator Lambert Brown, and he spoke about this new other tax, but it was just tax for them. Everything was just tax the Jamaican people, Mr. President. But, so when I looked on it, when I checked it, what did I find from Senator Lambert Brown? Senator Lambert Brown said, and he was quoted in the Sunday Observer of May 10, 2015. 2015. Where he said, it was a suggestion from the business sector, and he sought to explain it, but then when it is explained further, what he was talking about as the $1 tax, you know, is a tax that would affect several things, including debit card. It wouldn't apply to credit card alone. So then, a lot of the small people use debit cards, Mr. President. So, let us hear what Senator Lambert Brown said. It was a suggestion from the business sector in lieu of another tax that the government, the PNP government, had proposed that some of us call the $1 tax. But he just went on to suggest, saying to the opposition, you would be better off urging businesses to just pay the tax than seeking relief. What a heart! What a heart! This is the same Senator Brown that comes in here every day and talk about the poor people and people suffering hardship. And he says, don't seek relief, just pay the tax. That is what was coming from Senator Brown, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, we're coming to more, man. We're coming to more. But he said, you didn't hear.
No, I'm never here. You're never here.
When he speaks of hardship for poor people, he was saying poor people must just pay the tax. Don't seek no relief. Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President. All right. Just go, take it easy. Mr. President, it was the Jamaica Labour Party opposition in the lower house, led by the Honourable Minister now of Justice Delroy Chuck. And I will quote what Delroy Chuck had to say. Supported by Carl Samud and Ardishaw, where they sought to eke out some relief for the Jamaican taxpayer. Mr. President, and there were proposals, don't just put it at $3 million. Increase the threshold to $5 million, just to get some relief, because they would always have been outnumbered in the vote. And ask for the startup companies to not face this draconian tax for 2 years. But let us look on what Delroy Chuck said at the time. Delroy Chuck is quoted, this is taken from the Gleaner that reported on the debate in the House, Mr. Check it for accuracy. Delroy Chuck, Member of Parliament for North East St. Andrew, said the imposition of the tax was inimical to growth and urged the government to reconsider it. Likening the minimum business tax to a poll tax, which refers to any fee, however indirect, that is required for one to vote, Chuck said, if the country is to grow, business should not be burdened with so many types of taxes. This legislation is likely to take us in the wrong direction rather than in the right direction. So, Mr. President, members of the opposition at the time spoke against it, asked for its reconsideration, it was still imposed by the taxation government of the PNP and Peter Phillips. Mr. President, what I got from that time, is that, Mr. President, and they're still sitting over there, so when I hear the comments sometimes, sitting in this chamber, and I listen to him, Senator Sofa Beans, I can't believe it's the same person who sat over here and voted in support of that draconian tax. But there was an affinity, it seems, Mr. President, there is an affinity of the PNP administration under Peter Phillips to wield the Tax Act. They wield the Tax Act. Because, Mr. President, it was the Honourable Peter Phillips as Minister of Finance that imposed 60 billion of new taxes on the backs of Jamaicans. 2012, 19 billion new taxes. 2013, 15 billion in new taxes. Mr. President, 2014, 6.7 billion. And 2015, 10 billion in new taxes. Mr. President, when you looked at where the taxes were, up to patty the tax. And persons were talking about in another place, make we tax the handcart too. Mr. President, in 2013 there were taxes imposed on the backs of Jamaicans. Tax on telephone, tax on prepaid voucher. Is the little man use prepaid voucher, Yes, prepaid voucher for telephone calls. Income tax increase. Customs administration fees increase. All right. Senator Brown, we didn't keep this one. The increase in stamp duty, we reduce it. We didn't keep it. And the increase in transfer tax, we said no, we're not keeping it. We reduce it to 2%. Mr. President, the increase fees on the gross profit structures of betting, gaming and lotteries, the increased property tax by 160% is poor people not own house. They have to rent house. When you are in, it is the Jamaica Labour Party administration that reduced the tax rates so that we got a return back to 2010 levels. So when you're increasing and putting burden on poor people who have to pay rent.
Senator Fraser Beans, you're only allowed to help you from your assigned seat.
By 160%. So those were just some of the few. Increase in gas too and fuels, the oil that you have to throw in a vehicle, they were taxing those. Increase in taxi fare came as a result of that. That is what you brought upon the poor people of Jamaica. And so, Mr. President, I sat here again today, and I now hear comments coming, and Senator Brown made mention of it when he said, oh, the Honourable Peter Phillips has spoken about a reduction in GCT. Yes. Mr. President, what I want to see is whether this comment is one that can be believed or can be trusted. Hear me now, Mr. President. Hear me. Mr. President, this call, Sapphire, hold on a little bit. Mr. President, this call by the Honourable Peter Phillips. This is the same man who was throwing tax on Jamaicans. But it's not new, It's not anything new. Because Senator Brown could only refer to budget debate of 2016 or 2017 that the call was made. Hear this, Mr. President. In 2011, May of 2011, Minister Ardley Shaw tabled a green paper in this Parliament proposing a reduction in the GCT to 12.5%. So, Mr. President, when Senator Brown gets up here today and wants to talk about that is novel, the primary school kids in Jamaica will tell him, say that's stale. It's stale. Because it was in that green paper that Minister Shaw tabled in this parliament. So, Mr. President, that's not new, it's not fresh. You have to reel and come again. Mr. President, I can't stand here because I'm not the Minister of Finance. I'm not the Minister of Finance, none of us are. But I am certain that this administration listens to the people. This administration considers all the possibilities. This administration considers the factors that will bring relief to the Jamaican people. And I am certain that if it can be done, if it can be facilitated, the history has shown to the people of Jamaica that the Jamaica Labour Party administration will act in an appropriate way. Mr. President, if you look back at that green paper tabled in this parliament in 2011, it also proposed an increase in the personal income tax threshold from what it was in 2011 of $507,312 to $624,000 in 2014. So when you're talking about that, it's already in the green paper. The Jamaica Labour Party administration had that in mind. Mr. President, today the threshold is 1.5 million. Members can recall that it was the present opposition who even criticized. I sat down in here when 1.5 was being spoken about. We were criticized about it. It can't be done. Mr. President, they found every possible excuse to throw out against the 1.5. The Jamaica Labour Party is working in the best interest of Jamaican people. Mr. President, it was this administration that said no new taxes, and it was done. Mr. President, this administration, we have removed asset tax, we reduced the property tax, we reduced transfer tax, we reduced stamp duty, we have increased the threshold on estate duty and GCT. Mr. President, today we will repeal the wicked minimum business tax. And when you look at the Jamaican people, I heard from Senator Webby, who has said, use it wisely. Use the relief wisely. Mr. President, the Jamaican people are known to be innovative. They have known to be persons who tried hard, regardless of the circumstances. This administration, through its tax measures and the removal of these burdensome taxes, is giving the Jamaican people an opportunity. And I am certain they will use it. We don't operate like any other government that saw FinSac, where 40,000 businesses went into oblivion. So we try and ensure through tax measures that we give persons an opportunity by removing burdensome taxes from the backs of Jamaicans. Mr. President, this is an administration that can be believed and trusted to deliver for the people of Jamaica. And I want to, in closing, Mr. President, just point out to my friends that in spite of the reductions, we are being told that tax revenues are above what was budgeted. What we need to do, and you must commend the TAJ for their efforts, commend them, to ensure that there is efficiency in collection. You don't have to put a minimum business tax to collect. Just do efficient collection. And so what you have seen in some regard, and I'm in the local government, and we have to ensure that the property tax is paid. And so what you find happening, Mr. President, is that you don't just cause situations where persons have to go to the Inland Revenue Department, which may be somewhere away, it may be difficult for them to get there. And also, you may have long lines in these departments. They now have vehicles that go out into the field. That improves on the efficiency and reduces the burden on the person who wants to pay their property tax, but can't leave from up in the hills of Maroon Town, for instance, to come into Montego Bay to go to the Inland Revenue to pay the property tax. The vehicle goes here and there's collection. And when you look on the sums that are collected through the mobile unit, very significant. And if it is done in an efficient way, one that reduces the burden on the individual, I am certain that we will continue to see our tax collection going above what is budgeted. So, Mr. President, those are my few words. I believe this administration working in the best interest of Jamaicans and ensuring that there is great opportunity. If they use it wisely, we have increased employment and we have a better life for our citizens. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Sinclair. Senator Morris.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to make my contribution to the debate on the repealing of the Minimum Business Tax Act. And in doing so, Mr. President, you know, context is always important in any analysis. And context is extremely important in any debate. And it's a good time to come after Senator Sinclair, because in his presentation, he spoke of where we are today, but failed to mention how we reach where we are. And last week, because I am one person who I pay very close attention to public affairs, and I was listening to speeches at a particular event being held at the National Arena. And whilst I listened to the presentation, I heard a leader from overseas making mention of the situation that confronted Jamaica, in 2013, and spoke to the precarious position that Jamaica was in, and the fact that Jamaica today is being hailed as the poster boy because we have managed to overcome the challenges that we had incurred. But, Mr. President, a lot of people will always, because I have always heard that success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. And we fail to remember what transpired in the lead up to 2012, where the IMF program was abandoned and we had serious problems in terms of negotiating a new IMF deal. The previous IMF program, which came into effect in 2009. In 2009. And there were certain agreements that were laid down, and by 2011, those agreements were abandoned. Those agreements were abandoned. And because of that, when we reach into 2012 and a new administration came into play, we were now forced to renegotiate a new agreement with the IMF. The people never wanted to see us because of how the previous agreement was ended. Fiction, you need to check your facts because you are known for manipulating the facts. But I am talking about the reality of the situation. The truth of the matter is, by 2012, the then Minister of Finance had to engage in an intense discussion with the IMF. And I heard your Prime Minister, and tell me that this is fiction, I heard your Prime Minister saying, thanks to our friends in the Congressional Black Caucus for coming in and helping us. Why was he congratulating and thanking the members of the Black Caucus? Why did they have to intervene? They had to intervene because of the enormous difficulty that Jamaica was having in terms of negotiating the New Deal, because your administration had abandoned the program. And as a result, the current leader of the opposition, Dr. Peter Phillips, and the then Minister of Finance engaged in an intense discussion. I remember the current Prime Minister say, sign any deal. Sign any deal. Anything you get, take. And he stood his ground and negotiated. And I remembered Dr. Phillips saying in 2013 that he worked with 2 documents for the 2013 budget debate. One was the budget, and the other was a letter. Because if by that time he never got an indication from the IMF that the program was approved, he would have had to tender his resignation. The mere fact that he did not contributed to where we are today, because he led the rescue mission for Jamaica. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. President, a number of measures had to take place and shape. At the time, Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio was bordering close to 145%. Serious problems we were in. So when I hear people talking about the fact that we have reduced the debt to the GDP to where we are today, they want to take the praises, but they don't want to talk about the pain that we had to go through And a part of the pain, Mr. President, was the imposition of this minimum business tax that is being repealed today. And I am happy that it is being repealed. But it is don't make it look as if we hadn't to put in measures that was going to really give Jamaica a fighting chance. The same fighting chance and the same successes that you are reaping today. So the fact of the matter is that we have moved from 145% of GDP in terms of our debt to GDP ratio. We are now down to below 100%. No, you can't. So you are going to take the credit for all of that, Senator Braham. You know, I know you are a reasonable and rational man. You know. No, but it can't be categorized as wickedness. It was a necessity. It was a necessity. All right. The fact of the matter is that we had to bring down the national debt. You know, I remember, you know, Mr. President, I remembered, Mr. President, Mr. President, you know, I have to refer to the President when I'm speaking, you know, because I can't get myself in any trouble when I refer to the President, right? So, Mr. President, I remembered when we went to the NHT to get budgetary support. The said government now, opposition then, was fundamentally opposed to the cause. I wonder if I wonder what they have done since then. What they have done since then. So the fact of the matter is that we were in a crisis situation. The country was in a crisis situation and it required significant responses. Some of the responses were difficult responses, right? But the fact of the matter is, Mr. President, we are reaping the benefits today. We are reaping the benefits today. And I want to say, don't come and crow about the successes and don't talk about the measures that had to be put in place for us to reach where we are. Because, pardon me, what was that? Yeah, I mean, yes, and 18 years that you were rejected. That means you weren't doing something. You were not attractive to the people of Jamaica. Okay. Mr. President, I am very much happy that we are making this step, because as Senator Brown said, it was never intended to be a permanent part of the Jamaican tax mechanism. And so what we are seeing is that as there are improvements in the economy, because the debt to GDP ratio is being reduced and there is greater stability in the economy, we are seeing some of the benefits being being transferred to the city. And I'm happy for that. And the final point that I want to make, because this is something that I heard being bantered last week, you know, about Jamaica's international reputation being restored. And I said to myself when I heard the comment, the fact is that in 2011, our international reputation was severely smeared because of how the previous IMF agreement was ended. Serious, and not just that alone, but because in 2010 there were other events that had taken place in the country to smear the reputation of the country. And so when you talk about repairing the breach, repairing the breach that was caused in 2010, you want us to bring us there? All right? Yeah, man, he was making the rounds all over, man. Yeah, man, he was making the rounds all over. But Mr. President, I was happy to know that as a part of that administration, you know, we welcomed several world leaders because they started to come to Jamaica to say, well done in terms of how you have gone about to implement the IMF program. And even the head of the IMF came here and uttered it herself. President Barack Obama came here and said it himself. And several other world leaders. It was the first in my lifetime that I've seen so many high-profile international leaders coming to Jamaica in quick succession to give their support because of the economic recovery program that was implemented by the Portia Simpson Miller-led administration under the directive of Dr. Peter Phillips when he was the Minister of Finance. And so, Mr. President, I have no doubt that the context was extremely important, and we are at a point now where we are removing the minimum business tax. And I am happy that it is taking place. And I say to the Jamaican people that we're a part of the sacrifice, we're a part of the pain, that, you know, we hope that you will make the best use of the opportunity that has come because of this release. May it please you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Morris. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much. And I want to thank colleagues for their contribution to the debate. It has been a lively one, in which some interesting points have been made. Some which need to be addressed, and others which probably should be better left ignored. But Mr. President, regarding a very good point which was made by Senator Haughton when he asked about the ability of MSMEs to participate in special economic zones as one of the ways in which the administration could demonstrate its commitment to supporting MSMEs, as we have indicated that we do. And the fact is that the Act does provide for facilitation of SMEs. It allows them to apply for authorization from the authority to have a 4-year window within which they can try to put themselves in the position to meet all of the criteria to be full-fledged participants in the zone. So it does, it requires them, of course, to be incorporated and to have a development plan, a business plan, and to demonstrate development potential, but that is only clearly reasonable if you're speaking about getting into a formal arrangement where you will be receiving significant tax concessions. There must be demonstrated business potential. So I just wanted to assure the member that that is a matter that has been considered, it is operationalized, and perhaps it would be a good thing, maybe where we are failing is letting MSMEs know that this is an opportunity that is available if you are in fact formalized and seeking to grow and you have a good business plan. So thank you for raising that, because it is an important point in relation to how we are looking at MSMEs in a serious way. Mr. President, I think it is important to, simply for the record, there has been a great deal of effort made to try to create a narrative that the Jamaica Labour Party administrations have no care for the poor and have damaged the economy, and it is the PNP administrations that sought to bring it back. And I feel that, for the record, it is important that that be corrected. And I just want to just put a couple points on the table, and that is to start with the fact that the fiscal responsibility framework was tabled in 2010 by then Minister of Finance Audley Shaw. 2010, whereby the Financial Administration and Audit Act and the Public Bodies Management Authorities Act, which are an Accountability Act, which are major pillars of our fiscal responsibility framework, were tabled at that point in time. So in addition to the reduction which had been put forward, although not taken on board, this was a fundamental pillar. Mr. President, it was then Minister Audley Shaw who also spoke, from even in opposition, about approaching the multilaterals and moving away from the high interest rate policy to reschedule our debt and move it down to single-digit interest rates, which he did, and which manifested itself in lower mortgage rates, in lower inflation rates, in lower lending rates, Mr. President. All of these things which affected people at every level of society, including allowing businesses to be able to employ more people, more Jamaicans. Mr. President, the question was asked, why is it that we did not remove the minimum business tax immediately? But Mr. President, what did we do in our first year in? We moved the personal income tax threshold from 592,000 to $1 million. Yes. That is at the base of your civil service. It then moved from 592 was the last one before. We moved it from 592 to $1 million, and then from $1 million to 1.5. This is a 1.5 plan, which they said it could not be done. They said it couldn't be done until we did it. We did it, but we could not do everything. We could not. We could not do everything. We could not do everything at once, Mr. President. We could not do everything at the same time. I believe in that year was the very same year that we ensured that we reinstated the junior stock exchange concessions to ensure that these companies can grow and employ more people. They said they would have closed it. In fact, it ended and we had to start it back, reinstate it. Mr. President, there are many things that we have done. And just one more point, because it's just so fundamental and people tend to forget. People tend to forget that it has been demonstrated that while we speak about our success in bringing down the debt to GDP ratio from a high of 147% down to 95%. Mr. President, a Capri study demonstrated that the majority of the debt with which we continue to struggle was accumulated between 1996 and 2003. 1996 and 2003. 2003 when our debt moved from 79, debt to GDP ratio, moved from 79% to 141% in 2003. Inflation rates went as high as 80%. 80% in 1991, Mr. President. And yet they try to press this narrative that it's the Jamaica Labour Party administrations that have damaged the economy. Mr. President, another fact that people tend to forget is when we fell into difficulties with the IMF regime in 2011. We had to pay, Mr. President, it was to pay arrears, billions of dollars to the civil servant, billions of dollars. And this is not to lay blame, as Senator Brown is trying to say. It's not a function of blame, but it is to say that the payments were made. They were viewed as important. It had to be done, and it was done. And it was done regretfully at the detriment of the IMF program, to the detriment of the IMF program. But it was very much those payments, billions of dollars to civil servants, which throw things out. None of it was. So again, I don't seek to lay blame. I only enunciate the facts, Mr. President. It was difficult times, and difficult choices were made, and consequences were paid. That is the burden of leadership. But to stand and say that it is the Labour Party administration that damaged the economy and that damaged our reputation overseas is simply false, Mr. President, and the record could not stand. The record could not stand with those assertions being made. So, Mr. President, that being said, I just want to thank the members who recognize the good that lies within the removal of the minimum business tax. I want to recognize that the retroactivity is to January 1, 2019. Unfortunately, they could not go beyond that because it would throw out budgeting matters, but I will raise the point to Minister of Finance, as it has been raised here, that it could be looked beyond. But this act the bill that we have before us today makes it retroactive to January 1, 2019. And I just want to recognize that notwithstanding the bill itself, because the question was asked, when will the bill be in effect?
So President,
and of course,
clarification. Just a point of clarification I'm seeking. Yeah. All right, cool.
Yes, Mr. President. I was indicating that the removal, the repeal, is retroactive to January 1, 2019. But also, Mr. President, sorry, I've gotten thrown off just a little bit.
No, it wasn't his intention. He just got carried
away.
But
it was retroactivity that was raised, as well as a question about when it would take effect. And the point is that it has been zero rated from April. So in effect now, the minimum business tax is zero rated. But what this will do is formalize it by removing the tax entirely from the roll and make it retroactive to January. So the issue about the effectiveness of the bill, which will go through its normal process, it's already passed in the lower house, passed here, and will go to the GG for assent. No doubt with expedition, but the fact is that the manifestation is already there by the zero rating which had taken place. So, Mr. President,
Senator Brown, you wanted a point of clarification. I recognize you from a seat other than your own. I think it's the first time. I ask the members to recognize that this is the first time that Senator Brown.
I've been here before. President, I seek a clarification. The minimum business tax is an annual tax of 60,000. If you're removing it for this year, it has to be from January to December. There's no retroactivity. You're simply removing it from this year. And could the ministers confirm that?
The act is effective from January 1 because there would have been payments that were made already, because the payments are made in February, and the provisional order that zero rated it was only effective in from April 1, when the revenue measure was announced. So with that, I am moving, Mr. President, for the approval of the bill, for it rather to be read a second time.
Thank you. The question is that the bill be read for a second time. Those in favor? Aye. Against?
A bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Minimum Business Tax Act, read a second time.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The Senate will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole Senate to consider the bill clause by clause. Thank you very much. I put clause 1. Those in favor? Against? Ayes have it. I put clause 2 and 3. Those in favor? Against? Ayes have it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Against? The question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Those in favor? Against?
Mr. President, I ask.
I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Minister?
Mr. President, I ask for third reading of the bill.
The question is that the bill be read for a third time. Those in favor? Against?
A bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Minimum Business Tax Act, read a third time and passed.
Mr. President, it is on the motion for adjournment, Senator Longmore will make a presentation. Thank you.
Propose to do any further business today, Senator Longmore, you may stand.
Thank you.
How long this section has to be?
It's just a one pager, not one of your presentations. You understand? I thought we were playing nice. Mr. President, I rise on the motion for adjournment to recognize a matter of national importance, which is Jamaica's participation in the observance of the International Day to End Violence Against Women. I am heartened to see yourself and my fellow colleagues on both sides. I notice Senator Brown is not, but maybe we don't foist our opinions on others. We give free choice. I am heartened to see that my colleagues are wearing the purple ribbon in support of recognizing the 25th of November as being the day to end, the International Day to End Violence Against Women. And as we're wearing this ribbon and as we're recognizing, I just want us to become a bit more aware as to the genesis of this day. And it came out of 1960, November 25, in the Dominican Republic. The Mirabel sisters, who led a rebellion against a then corrupt regime, were ambushed, tortured, raped, and eventually murdered. And so the Latin American and Caribbean countries met in 1981 and agreed to observe November 25th each year as the International Day to End Violence Against Women. And so I'm very proud to be here bringing that recognition in 2019 to this day here in Jamaica. It is a 16-day campaign, actually, that runs until the 10th of December, which is Human Rights Day. And so we are encouraged that we can wear the ribbons until then. Mr. President, the theme for this year's commemoration here in Jamaica is Stand Up, Talk Up against gender-based violence. It is not a private matter. And it is an invitation of all Jamaicans to participate in the movement to end violence against our women. And let me underscore that when we say violence against women, we recognize that men also do undergo violence, our children, other communities, but this particular day is to recognize the need of our women in this particular fight. The need for our legislators, for us as legislators, as well as each and every citizen to stand up and talk, Mr. President, is great. We see from the Women's Health Survey that a quarter of our women have been physically abused, whether punched, kicked, boxed, however, slapped in some way by their partners. A further quarter of women have been sexually abused by non-partners. 1 in 5, Mr. President, before the age of 18. And Mr. President, I won't go into the verbal abuse, the emotional abuse, because those sometimes you can't even measure. And these figures are significantly, I suspect, underreported because of the stigma that is even attached with seeking help for some of these women. Mr. President, the emotional and psychological impact is one that we cannot even recognize or fathom to recognize. The physical impact is obvious, but when a woman goes through abuse, the emotional impact that hits her and the persons that she cares for, a lot of times these women are people who are heads of their households, and so their children suffer, their co-workers suffer, purposes around them suffer, and so it is a significant trauma, the mental and psychological impact of this. And I want to also recognize a form of abuse that we very, very oftentimes don't see, which is that of neglect. And particularly in homes where fathers are absent, a lot of women are suffering from the neglect of the co-parenting that is required to raise children. A lot of children, it has become such a normalized situation where in my other role where I teach medical students, when they are relating about the social structure of a family and the father is not absent, they just skirt over it. And I have to bring it back to them and say, hello, that patient is a victim of neglect. It is a victim of abuse. And so we have become so normalized for the absence of men within the society that that form of abuse is significantly impacting and significantly unrecognized. Mr. President, the government has embarked on a program to establish shelters for such victims, for the very, very heinous acts. We see where one shelter was recently opened, and there is movements to acquire 2 further facilities to see to these needs of our women within our society. We also recognize that there is significant effort led by the Minister Grange, of public education efforts through the Bureau of Gender Affairs. They are implementing a stand-up, talk-up information sessions throughout the island. The first one was actually started in St. Mary, which had over 200 participants and was resoundingly successful. As we're speaking, there is one actually going on now at the Courtly Auditorium. Mr. President, I have to just reinforce and reiterate the need for us as legislators, as regular Jamaican citizens, to stand up and talk up. Let us take inspiration from the 4-year-old twins that were here in Parliament last week, little Nakosi and Tafaya Wright. When they spoke up as advocates for their children, let us talk up and be advocates for the women in our lives. I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Longmore. Senator Brown?
Yes, Mr. President. The opposition expressed our support for the international fight against violence against women and girls. And in fact, against violence against everybody, because even men are the victim of some of these fights. We share the view that that since November 25th, the 16 days of action that has been called for gender-based, it has our support. The reality is, in the last 2 or more years, there has been an increase in violence against women. We have to come together and work to preserve this. It means we need to fast track sexual harassment. It means we have to provide the resources that allow the security force to intervene quicker and earlier so we may save lives. The opposition is committed. You came late, so you would know that was multiple. The opposition note that the slogan is to arrange the world. Generation equality stands up against rape. And this is why the person was designated to speak for us had come in her orange dress, not because she was going anywhere else, but in support of this cause. She wanted to orange up the world. So, President, to me now, people, children, women are being raped. And if this call, Senator Longmore, is for us to work together, to eliminate, to reduce first and eliminate, you have our support. And we wish that this society will treat much better the women and children. More need to be done, more can be done. As Elijah Cummings would say, we're better than this. Let's do better. May it please you, Mr. President.
Minister?
Mr. President, I would just close in thanking the members for their contributions, and especially Senator Longmore. And just to add my own personal words of support to the 16 days of activism for the marking the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. I endorse everything that was stated by Senator Longmore, and certainly I'm in support of the activities being led by the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sports. And I want to just note that there have been interesting events that have been put forward by, for example, the students at Mary C. Cole Hall. They generate a great deal of activity and sensitization on the campus for over the 16 days, including the use of a clothesline project where either victims or persons in support of victims can put messages on T-shirts that are hung on clotheslines as a sort of visual representation of the impact that is had on young women on and off campus, clearly. And they had just yesterday a new event which was called Walk a Mile in Our Shoes, where men were encouraged to come and walk in women's shoes significantly, symbolically, to signaling the discomfort that women experience in their daily lives by virtue of sexual harassment and other violence. So, Mr. President, I just want to note those efforts that are being made all across the island, as a matter of fact, to highlight the issue and to try to build sensitivity around the issue, and to pledge, of course, the support of the Senate in this regard. So, Mr. President, it is not intended to do any further business. I ask that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed.
Thank you, Madam Minister. The question is that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed. Those in favor? Aye. Against? This Honourable Senate now stands adjourned.
Wait, hold on. Colin, hey, what go on? You know, say,